Good evening and welcome back to Legends of Dracula. Imagine yourself stepping down from a creaking carriage into a world made only of snow and shadow. The road behind you has vanished under drifting white. The sky above is a low iron lid, and the Carpathian mountains rise around you like sleeping giants whose breath is the wind. Ahead, a lonely inn leans against the storm, its roof bowed, its shutters fastened tight. Candlelight seeps through the cracks, thin and golden, like a promise that might hold. When you push open the door, it groans on its hinges, and a wave of warmer air brushes your face. Wood smoke, melted wax, a trace of spiced wine, and the faint metallic chill that always seems to follow you in these lands where history never quite lies still. Inside, the world is smaller, softer. The hiss of logs in the hearth, the sigh of the chimney, the quiet clink of an innkeeper setting down the last clean cup. Floorboards creak under your boots, then under his, then settle. Outside, the snow keeps falling, but its fury is muffled now, pressed against the shuttered windows that rattle when the wind remembers its strength. Tonight we travel nowhere else. You have arrived. Your cloak is heavy with frost. Your fingers sting as they thaw, and each breath you draw feels like the first truly safe breath in miles. Safe enough, at least, to listen. The innkeeper, broad-shouldered and careful with his words, nods you toward the fire, and the flames paint his face in amber and shadow, as if he has stood here for centuries, watching travelers come and go, and sometimes not come back at all. On the wall, an old clock ticks, slow, patient, relentless. Each second is a footstep toward midnight. The innkeeper makes his last round, snuffing one candle, trimming another, checking the iron bar across the back door. He glances at the clock more often than he glances at you. It is an old habit, older perhaps than he is. In this valley, names matter, and so do ours. There is a rule the villagers keep without needing to speak it aloud. No one knocks after midnight. Not a neighbor, not a traveler, not even a lost shepherd from the high passes. If a hand seeks your door once the clock has turned, it is said, that hand no longer belongs entirely to the living. Now dim the lights in your own room and imagine the little chamber the innkeeper shows you. Rough-hewn bed, woolen blankets, a single candle guttering on the table. The storm's weight presses on the roof. Wolves howl somewhere beyond the river, their voices stretched thin by distance and snow. The clock below stairs draws closer to 12, each tick a soft tap at the edge of your thoughts. You lie back, travel-worn, listening as the fire in the hearth settles with small sighs and crackles. The inn falls into a deep, deliberate silence. No voices, no footsteps, just wind and wolves and the measured heart of the clock. Then, as your eyes begin to close, the stillness breaks. 3 slow, deliberate knocks echo down the corridor. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. You hold your breath, counting the spaces between those 3 soft knocks and the next sigh of the wind. In that stretched-out silence, the corridor of the inn seems to lengthen, and the world beyond its wooden walls begins to widen as well. Because this is not just any corridor, and not just any night. This is the Carpathian night, in lands where history, legend, and fear have shared the same shadow for centuries. When the sun sinks behind these mountains, the world does not simply grow dark, it grows older. Every gust of wind feels like a page of some forgotten story turning, and every distant wolf cry sounds a little like a name being called. Imagine yourself stepping, in thought only, beyond the inn's thick stone walls. Outside, the snow lies deep over Transylvania and Wallachia, over villages that cling to the edges of forests, over roads that twist toward the Ottoman frontier. Mist curls up from the valleys, smoke drifts from low chimneys, and above it all the ridges of the Carpathians rise like the spine of some sleeping creature. Safe enough at least to listen, you stand at the edge of a world where a torch on a distant hill might mean a wedding feast, or a raid, or an execution. Tonight we travel further back into the 15th century, when these same passes and river crossings were ruled by a prince whose name you already know, Vlad, son of Vlad Dracula. Vlad Dracula. Names matter, and his was heavy with power and omen. Son of the dragon, or, whispered more nervously, son of the devil. He was a real ruler of Wallachia, not a velvet-cloaked count in a London novel, and the forests he filled were not with bats, but with the impaled bodies of enemies and traitors. We will walk through his life soon enough, his childhood as an Ottoman hostage, his wars, his atrocities, and the strange afterlife that turned him from frontier warlord into immortal vampire. In these lands, though, history never walked alone. It moved beside folklore, especially after midnight. Villagers told stories of crossroads where the living should not linger, of thresholds that must be guarded, of guests who must never be invited in once the clock has struck 12. A stranger who arrives too late may be a tax collector, a conscription officer, or something worse, and a hand that knocks so gently, so patiently, may already belong to the dead. To live here, in Wallachia or along the Ottoman border, was to sleep lightly. A knock at the door might summon you to pay coin you did not have, to march in a war you did not choose, or to answer for a rumor you did not start. One sound in the night could change a life, or end it. Over time, that fear learned to travel. It moved from campfire whispers into German pamphlets and woodcuts, painting Vlad as a monster for distant readers. Centuries later, it crossed the continent again, into a London bookshop, where a writer named Bram Stoker opened an old history and borrowed a single loaded word: Dracula. And now that long journey curls back to this inn, this corridor, this door that still has not opened. The knocking stops for a moment. Then once more, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. You hear those 3 slow knocks, and for a heartbeat your mind wants to stand in that corridor, inches from the wood, breath held. But you are not there. Imagine yourself instead where you truly are, in your own room, in your own bed, the mattress familiar beneath you, the weight of your blankets a gentle, steady pressure, like a hand resting kindly on your shoulder. The darkness around you is not the inn's uncertain shadow, but the ordinary darkness of your walls and ceiling, a darkness that has watched you sleep many nights before. Now dim the lights inside your thoughts. Let the inn step back, as if seen through a long tunnel of candlelit corridors. You are far from Transylvania, far from the snow-muted village and its creaking signboard. You are wrapped, enclosed, nested in fabric and habit, and the quiet, domestic sounds of wherever you are tonight. A distant car, perhaps, a humming heater, the soft sigh of a house that knows your footsteps. The knocking at the inn's door continues to exist, but only a sound carried by a story. It is like watching a storm from behind thick glass. You can see the lightning flare. You can imagine the wind clawing at shutters in those old borderlands between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Yet your own air is still and warm. Safe enough at least to listen. This is the promise of tonight's journey. The story will walk along the edge of fear because that is where Gothic tales have always loved to wander, through graveyards and crossroads and lonely inns where guests arrive after midnight. But it will walk slowly, gently, never rushing you, never pushing you closer than you wish to go. If the history grows darker, the voice will grow softer. If the prince's shadow lengthens, your blankets can always be pulled a little higher. Tonight we travel in an unusual way. You are not a character in the inn, not a nervous servant carrying a candle, not the innkeeper wondering whether to lift the latch. You are something lighter, quieter, a ghostly observer drifting through centuries and rooms, able to pause above a snowbound roof or hover over a page in Bram Stoker's notebook, unseen and untouched. Knocks cannot reach you here. Wars cannot conscript you. Even the sharpest fangs are only ink and imagination. Remember, this is a sleep story. It borrows its colors from old woodcuts and torchlight, from pamphlets that once demonized a Wallachian prince named Dracula, yet it has been woven for rest. The rhythm of sentences, the slow unfolding of history, the way scenes follow one another like waves on a shore, all of it is meant to lull, not to startle. So let the inn return now, but keep your distance. Picture the corridor again, the candle guttering, the frost on the window. The door remains closed. The latch is firm. On the other side, a guest waits, patient, timeless. For now, you do not have to open anything. You need only listen to how he came to stand there, and why his name, above so many others, still has the power to knock. For now you do not have to open anything. The door, the latch, even your own eyes may stay as they are, half drifting in the half-dark. Imagine yourself simply resting where you are, while the wind prowls outside your own windows, and this quiet story moves at its own unhurried pace. If this kind of slow, snow-muffled journey feels familiar to you, if you find a certain comfort in following history down long corridors and through older shadows, you might decide, on some other night, to return here, not now. Tonight we travel without demands, without urgency, but on a future evening when the day has been loud and the world feels sharp-edged, you could slip back to this channel as you would to a favorite inn, and, if you wish, quietly subscribe so the candle is always lit for you. Now dim the lights a little further in your mind and picture something curious. Beyond your own room, beyond your building, beyond your town, there are other listeners, scattered across lands and seas. A student in a small dorm room where the radiator ticks like a nervous clock. A nurse on a break in a fluorescent hospital corridor, phone screen dimmed, earbuds soft as snow. Someone in a village not far from the old Ottoman roads, where the name of this prince still carries a peculiar weight. Names matter, even now. If you were to look down from very high above, you might see them as pinpricks of candlelight, bedsides in Sao Paulo, kitchen tables in Warsaw, a night bus rolling out of London, a quiet apartment in Manila where the curtains never quite close. All of them listening to the same knock, the same storm, the same uneasy guest outside a wooden door. If, tomorrow, after sleep has had its way with you, you feel like telling us where you listened from, you might leave a small note in the comments. Your city, your country, perhaps the hour on your clock when Dracula began to knock. You do not need to move to do this now. You do not need to break the spell of stillness you have woven around yourself. Safe enough at least to listen, you can let your limbs stay heavy, your breathing slow, and trust that these doors, the door of a channel, the door of a community, the door of a comment waiting for your words, will still be there in the morning. Because there are many doors in this story, the door of the inn rhymed with frost. The doors of Romanian churches where villagers once whispered prayers against the restless dead. The doors of printing houses in Saxon towns, where pamphlets about a fearsome Wallachian prince spilled into Europe like ravens from a startled tower. One kind of door opens onto a room of listeners. Another opens, very cautiously, onto a snowbound courtyard where someone waits. So let your attention drift back down the corridor. The YouTube doors can stay closed for now. We will return to them when candles are brighter and eyes are clearer. Ahead, the inn door stands where we left it, wood darkened by centuries of hands, iron latch cold as a river stone. On one side, the warmth of firelight and human breath. On the other, a figure, patient and uninvited, who has crossed many lands and legends to stand at this simple threshold and raise his hand to knock again. So before that hand falls again, before the sound of knuckles on wood echoes through this little inn in your imagination, let us make a quiet bargain with the night. This is a story, and you are safe where you are, safe enough at least to listen. Now dim the lights, if you can. Let the room fall into that soft half-dark where edges blur and shadows grow kind rather than cruel. Lower the brightness of any screens, or set them aside so their glow does not compete with the candlelight you're about to picture. If there is a fan nearby or a bit of white noise, let it run like a faint Carpathian wind, steady and low. Or simply decide that, for tonight, the only sound that matters is this voice, carrying you across lands and centuries, without asking you to move at all. Imagine yourself lying where you are, in your own bed, and notice the simple human details that the old chronicles always forget. The weight of your body sinking into the mattress as if the feathers or springs were snowdrifts making room for you. The warmth of blankets around your shoulders, a modern echo of wool and fur pulled close beside a medieval hearth. The slow rhythm of your breathing, rising and falling like a small private tide. You do not have to change it. Just notice it, the way a watchman on a Wallachian tower might quietly count his own breaths while scanning the dark for an Ottoman banner that never quite appears. Let your jaw loosen. Let your hands uncurl where they rest. Your legs grow heavier, as if the stories of the day were stones you can finally set down. Nothing to solve now, nothing to defend. Only a prince of a far frontier, and the way his name will travel. Names matter, especially in these lands. Dracula once meant simply Son of the Dragon, a title of chivalric honor worn by the boy who would become Vlad III. Before he was a monster in fiction, he was a ruler in a narrow, dangerous principality, caught between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, trying to hold a line that kept shifting beneath his feet. Tonight we travel back toward that boy, but gently, as if turning the crackling pages of an old history book rather than throwing open a castle gate. Think of it this way. Opening a Gothic novel or a dusty chronicle of battles and betrayals is like reaching for the inn's iron latch. One motion, and you let something cross the threshold into your thoughts. But tonight we open only the pages of time, not the door to danger. The guest may knock and we will listen, but he will remain on the safe side of the story. So let this become your ritual, night after night if you wish. The dimmed room, the steady breath, the quiet return to snow, to candlelight, to the Carpathian passes where wolves howl far away and the inn walls are thick. Each time, the day's worries can wait outside like impatient travelers turned from a full house. Now, with your body settled and your mind standing at that imagined threshold, we will leave the inn's present midnight hanging on the edge of a knock and step backward through the years. Back to the early 1400s, when a real child first opened his eyes in Transylvania, and the man behind the name Dracula drew his first breath in a world already trembling in the shadow of empire. Tonight we travel further back, past candle and inn and creaking floorboard, into a winter older than your language, older than your maps. Imagine yourself standing beneath a pale Transylvanian sky in the year 1431, when comets and eclipses still felt like personal messages from God, and every thunderstorm might have been a warning. You are in or near the small town of Sighisoara, clinging to a hill in what is now central Romania, then a frontier between Hungarian crowns and Wallachian princes. Steep red roofs huddled together against the cold. Narrow streets twist like questions between timbered houses, their upper stories leaning close, as if the buildings themselves are gossiping about the children born beneath them. Above, church spires and a clock tower stab at the clouds. Below, the stone foundations feel as old as the hills. Mist curls up from the Tarnava River, sliding between houses and under doors. Beyond the town walls rise the dark shoulders of the Carpathian Mountains, and behind them forests. Forests thick enough to swallow armies. Forests where wolves thread between black trunks, and where, in later centuries, strangers will swear they saw pale figures moving after midnight, long after the living should be asleep. Even now, just imagining it, you can feel why these lands were fertile soil for a certain kind of story. Somewhere in or just outside this town, in that year 1431, a child is born to a minor but ambitious prince. His father is Vlad, known to his contemporaries as Vlad Dracul. The title is not a rumor, not yet a curse. It comes from his admission to an elite chivalric brotherhood founded by the King of Hungary, the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christendom's crumbling borders against the advancing Ottoman Empire. A dragon coiled on a shield, a dragon stitched in gold on a cloak, a dragon invoked in oaths spoken before altars and swords. Names matter. In Latin, in courtly charters, Vlad is Dracu, the dragon. But in the local tongues, the word twists and darkens, dragon shades into devil, and a proud title begins to carry a hint of sulfur. In these villages where priests chant in candlelit naves and old women still mutter older prayers at the well, such a double meaning is not easily ignored. The child, when scribes bother to write of him, is called Dracula. Simply, the son of Dracul, son of the dragon, son of the devil. A name that fits awkwardly on a newborn, like armor several sizes too large, yet already heavy with expectation and fear. You can almost see the boy asleep in a wooden cradle, while above him, adults argue in whispers about borders and taxes and Ottoman raids, never guessing what echoes his name will one day carry. In this region, names cling like mist in a valley, long after the bodies that first wore them have gone to earth. They gather stories the way snow gathers on a roof, layer after layer, until the weight becomes dangerous. And some names once spoken never quite stop moving. They cross mountains, slip through forests, ride on the breath of travelers, and, centuries later, find their way to lonely inns and quiet doors, where they still know how to knock after midnight. Now, dim the lights a little further, and keep that cradle, that town, and that name in mind, as our story follows the child of the dragon into a world already waiting to be haunted by him. Tonight we travel not just with a child and his ominous name, but across an entire frontier where worlds grind against one another like slow stone wheels. Imagine yourself standing at the center of a great faded map, your finger resting on a narrow strip of land pressed between larger, hungrier colors. To the west, Latin and Catholic kingdoms, banners of crosses and crowned lions, the kingdom of Hungary looming like a mailed fist. To the east and south, the green tide of the Ottoman domains, the crescent banner pushing steadily up the valleys of the Danube. Between them, Wallachia, neither empire nor backwater, but a buffer, a bruise between blows, a land of tribute and raids and promises made at sword point. Armies pass through, taxes flow out. Loyalty is not a virtue here so much as a survival skill. In this tense strip of soil, Vlad's family wraps itself in a symbol. The Order of the Dragon, founded to defend Christendom against the Ottoman advance, chooses as its emblem a coiled dragon, jaws open, tail knotted around a cross, often set against or beside the crescent it vows to resist. It is a creature of scales and theology, part knightly club, part holy threat. Vlad's father takes the name Dracula from this order. The son becomes Dracula. Names matter, especially when they sound a little too much like devil in the ears of nervous neighbors. Imagine yourself now leaving the map and walking the roads that stitch these powers together. Mud clings to your boots. The ruts are deep, cut by merchant carts and mercenary wagons. You pass peasant villages of timber and thatch, smoke rising in thin, resigned threads. Beyond them, monasteries crouch behind low stone walls, their bells calling for prayer and, just as often, for help. Fortified towns huddle on hilltops, wooden palisades and rough towers watching the horizon for dust clouds that might mean traitors or raiders. News here does not arrive as tidy reports. It comes on the breath of a horse trader who saw burned farms 2 valleys away, in the torn sleeve of a soldier who swears the Ottoman cannons are bigger this year, in the nervous jokes of an innkeeper who has started bolting his door before midnight. History in these lands is not a distant chronicle. It is the sound of hooves in the dark. Over all this, the voivode, the local prince, tries to rule. He bows to the Hungarian king for 1 year, then sends tribute to the Ottoman sultan the next, while the boyars, the local nobles, plot, whisper, and occasionally change sides before breakfast. Power here is a 3-sided game played on a blood-slick board. Princes are made and unmade quickly. A feast can turn into an execution, a council into an ambush. In such a world, even titles become weapons. When enemies later call Vlad Tepes the Impaler and Dracula, they are not just describing him. They are advertising him, turning local terror into exportable legend. German pamphlets, court envoys, rival chroniclers, each adds another thorn to the name. Safe enough at least to listen, you will soon hear how that frontier fear, sharpened by ink and rumor, begins to sound less like politics and more like the birth of a monster. And as we leave these muddy roads for a moment, keep that dragon, that crescent, and that uneasy buffer land in mind, because the next part of our story will show what happens when a prince raised in this pressure cooker decides that fear itself can be his sharpest weapon. So when a grown Vlad later reaches for fear as if it were a familiar blade, he is only drawing on lessons that began much earlier, in rooms that smelled of wax and steel and whispered worry. Imagine yourself as a child in one of those rooms, in a princely court somewhere between forest and river, where the walls are hung with icons and weapons in almost equal measure. Morning begins with tutors, a monk tracing letters on a wax tablet, a Latin phrase about virtue and duty. a boyar's son drilling numbers for tribute tallies, a stern voice reciting the names of neighboring rulers who might be allies this year and enemies the next. Then the lesson changes. The tablet is set aside. A wooden sword is placed in your hand. Outside, in the courtyard, young Vlad learns to ride, to draw a bow, to feel the weight of a blade, the clatter of hooves, the sharp bark of commands, the sting of winter air on his face. It looks like play, like the natural work of a prince. Yet just beyond the stable walls, riders arrive spattered with mud, bringing rumors of an Ottoman raid across the Danube, of villages burned, of a banner with the crescent moon glimpsed through smoke. Childhood and campaign reports share the same afternoon. Tonight we travel, just for a moment, into the quiet between those reports. In the great hall, candles gutter as the evening meal is laid out. Coarse bread, roasted meat, dark wine. Vlad's father, Vlad Dracula, sits at the high table, speaking low with his counselors. Names matter, and at this table the names are heavy. The Hungarian king, the Ottoman sultan, rival princes in neighboring lands. The boy hears certain phrases again and again. Tribute, hostages, oaths. Tribute, in this world, is not an abstract word. It is wagons of grain creaking south toward Ottoman fortresses, chests of coin counted by tired officials, herds driven along muddy roads. And sometimes, more quietly, it is children, sons of Wallachian nobles, sent to the Sultan's court as living guarantees of their father's obedience. The bargain is simple and terrible: peace, or something like it, in exchange for silver and blood. You can imagine how that shapes a child listening from the shadows. He learns that safety is rented, never owned. That his father must bow just enough to the crescent to keep armies at bay, while never bowing so low that the Hungarian crown calls him traitor. Every gesture at court becomes double-edged. A cup raised in greeting might hide a plot. A smile from a boyar might conceal a count of how many men he can muster if the throne should suddenly fall vacant. Within his own lands, Vlad's father is surrounded by those boyar families, old and powerful, their loyalty as thin as the gold leaf on the icons they endow. At feasts, they laugh and trade toasts. In private, they weigh which claimant to the throne will best preserve their estates. A prince here rules, but never quite rests. And the prince's son watches, absorbing the lesson that danger does not only come from banners with foreign symbols, but from familiar coats of arms across the table. Now dim the lights in your mind's hall and listen to the quieter sounds, the hush that falls when adults think the children are not paying attention, the way voices drop when someone mentions the Sultan by name, the quick sideways glances when talk turns to who might be sent away next. In such an atmosphere, trust becomes a rare luxury. A boy like Vlad learns to read not only words on parchment, but the flicker of eyes, the tension in a jaw, the pause before an oath. History, for him, is not yet a story written in chronicles. It is the mood in the room when a messenger arrives after dark. It is the way his father's hand tightens on the armrest when news from the Ottoman court is announced. It is the realization that the same men who kneel today might stand over a fallen body tomorrow. What does that do to a young mind? To grow up where every promise might be a trap and every alliance a temporary bridge over a chasm. In this pressure, the seeds of his later methods are quietly planted. If betrayal is everywhere, then terror becomes a language everyone understands. If power is always slipping, then one must grip it with both hands, no matter how much blood they gather. Vlad does not yet command armies or forests of the impaled. He commands only his attention, his memory, his growing sense that mercy is a coin few can afford on this frontier. And as the years turn, the word hostage stops being a distant term and starts to circle closer, like a wolf at the edge of firelight. The same tribute that has carried grain and gold will soon carry something far more precious: the prince himself. His education, begun in Wallachian halls thick with incense and intrigue, is about to continue under different arches, in a court where the crescent does not lurk at the border, but shines from every banner. Safe enough at least to listen from our warm imagined inn, we will follow him there next, across the river and into the Ottoman world, where a boy named Dracula will learn a new script of obedience, cruelty, and calculated fear, and where the guest who knocks is no longer outside the gate, but already seated at the table. So tonight we travel with him, not as honored envoys, not as warriors with banners snapping in the wind, but as quiet shadows following two boys who ride south under guard toward a world that calls them guests and means hostages. Imagine yourself crossing that river with them. The air thickens, warmer, salt-tinged from distant seas you cannot see. The banners change. The dragon of the order gives way to the crescent of the Ottoman sultans, bright against a sky already bruising toward dusk. You pass stone fortresses, then broad roads, then at last a city where minarets spear the heavens, and the very skyline seems to whisper that power has moved. At dawn, the first thing you would hear is not a church bell, but the call to prayer. A single voice, then many, unfurling over domes and courtyards, like a long rising sigh. Fountains answer with their own music. Water spills into marble basins, cool and constant. Sunlight strikes glazed tiles so blue they seem stolen from the heart of the sky, and every surface, gold, lapis, polished stone, reminds a small frontier prince how small he truly is. This was hostage diplomacy, 15th century style. Names matter, and guest here meant that Vlad and his younger brother Radu were living promises. So long as their father in Wallachia obeyed, paid tribute, sent soldiers when called, the boys would study, ride, pray, and walk these tiled corridors unmolested. If he rebelled, if he wavered, if he even hesitated too long, their soft young throats paid the price. Everyone knew it. No one said it aloud. Their days were orderly, almost elegant on the surface. Tutors drilled them in Turkish and Arabic, in courtly Persian phrases that turned commands into poetry. They learned the arts of war from seasoned captains: how to sit a horse at full gallop, how to loose an arrow at a target, and then, for practice, at a suspended sheep carcass that swung bleeding above the sand. They were taught to bow at the proper angle, to kiss the hem of the right robe, to read a glance across a crowded hall and know instantly who could have them killed. And always, beneath the lessons, the truth. They were leverage. A vassal's heart could be far away in the northern forests, but his fear lived here. Now, dim the lights a little in your mind, and walk with Vlad into the training yards and public squares where that fear was made visible. He would have seen floggings in the dust, the crack of leather on skin echoing against stone. He would have passed bodies displayed at crossroads, hands or heads severed for theft, for desertion, for speaking unwisely about the Sultan. The Ottomans used impalement, too, sparingly, theatrically, as a warning that did not need translation. Imagine the lesson a boy like Vlad took from this. Order is not gentle. Terror can be organized, scheduled, written into law and ritual until it feels almost normal. Some nights, perhaps, he lay awake in a perfumed chamber, hearing the fountains murmur beyond the lattice, torn between fascination and loathing. Here was an empire that worked. Roads were patrolled, taxes gathered, rebellions crushed with terrifying efficiency. A part of him, the observing prince, must have admired the machinery. Another part, the hostage child, burned with hatred for the hand on the lever. In that tension, something in him hardened. He was learning not only how an empire commands, but how fear can be sharpened into policy, how public pain can become a language rulers speak to their subjects. Safe enough at least to listen, you and I can watch him storing these methods away, quiet as a scribe copying a forbidden text. One day, when he returns to his own restless lands, he will write his rule in that same script of discipline and dread. Only this time, he will be the one choosing who stands, and who hangs, and who is left on the stake at the edge of the road. And when that day comes, the forests of Wallachia will answer the tiled courtyards of the Sultan in a darker tongue. But in those same courtyards, under those same tiled roofs where punishments were measured out like lines of a careful script, another story was being written. One not on parchment, but in the quiet space between two brothers. Imagine yourself walking along a shaded colonnade of the Ottoman palace, the marble cool beneath your bare feet, the air scented with rosewater and coal smoke. Ahead of you, two boys move through the same corridor. One, dark-eyed and severe, walks as if every step might conceal a blade. The other, Radu, later called the Handsome, turns his head when people speak, smiles easily, and seems to belong here in a way his brother never quite will. Ottoman chroniclers, writing in careful script long after these boys became men, would praise Radu's grace. They would note his beauty, his soft voice in Turkish, his willingness to bow when the Sultan entered the room, to laugh at the right moments, to learn the music, the poetry, the subtle dance of courtly favor. To them, he was the ideal hostage prince, pliant, loyal, a young man who allowed the empire to shape him. Beside him, Vlad moved differently. He watched more than he spoke. Where Radu adapted, Vlad endured. Tutors drilled them both in language and faith, in the art of command and the geometry of battle lines, yet the lessons settled in each brother like water in different vessels. Radu flowed around obstacles. Vlad became a stone in the stream. Tonight we travel a little closer to that fracture, because this is where loyalty begins to split. Imagine the evenings in those lands, the call to prayer drifting over the courtyards, lamps being lit one by one, and the two brothers sitting together, speaking in low voices. One confides that perhaps the Sultan is not so terrible, that there is safety in obedience. The other stares toward the dark line of the horizon where Wallachia lies, and says nothing at all. In that silence, resentment grows. Not just between brothers, but inside Vlad himself. He is a prince, educated by his captors, learning their tongue, their codes of honor, their ruthless efficiency in siege and terror. He studies the disciplined ranks of janissaries, the swift punishment of rebels, the way impalement is used not merely as death, but as a warning that can be seen from miles away. And all the while he imagines those methods turned outward, away from the Sultan and back toward the forests of home. Names matter. Radu will earn names of affection in Ottoman sources, a favored client, almost a son. Vlad will carry the older, darker name, Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. Between them lies not just a difference of temperament, but a fault line that future Wallachian politics will pry open. Later, boyars will whisper that Radu is the Sultan's man, while Vlad is the scourge of traitors. Chroniclers will choose sides, and propaganda will paint one brother as civilized, the other as monstrous. Now, dim the lights in your mind, and picture Vlad years later, finally allowed to leave, riding away from the palace that schooled and caged him. He does not ride out empty-handed. He carries scars, yes, and memories of humiliation, but also a precise understanding of how fear travels faster than any army. The Ottoman court has given him a cruel gift, a toolkit of terror, polished and proven. One day soon, the same tactics that kept the Sultan's subjects obedient will bloom like a nightmare in Wallachia. And when the first forest of stakes rises under a cold moon, you will be able to trace each sharpened trunk back to these quiet corridors, and to two brothers who once walked them side by side. Tonight we travel away from marble halls and Ottoman courtyards, and back to smaller places, where history filters down as gossip and half-remembered prayer. Imagine yourself walking through a Wallachian village at dusk, the kind of place where the mud in the street knows every hoof that has ever crossed it, and the church bell sounds older than the stones around it. Here, the fall of a prince is not a treaty. It is a rumor spoken over bread and onions. The peasants do not say dynastic crisis or geopolitics. They say, almost casually, that the old dragon has lost a head, that his house has been split like a rotten beam. They talk of his sons in fragments, as if their lives were pieces of broken icons. One boy taken to the Turks, one boy left behind. One boy with the dragon's name. Names matter, especially in lands where the forest presses close and the night comes early. The villagers cannot quite shape Dracula on their tongues, so they play with it as they work. The dragon's whelp, the devil's chick, the little dragon who will grow sharp teeth. They do not know the boy, not really, but they know what they have heard, that his eyes are too sharp for a child, that when other boys shout and scuffle, he watches, calculating, his silence stretched just a little too long. Around low fires they embroider these details. A shepherd swears that when the child prince looked at him, the lamb in his arms went still, as if listening. An old woman insists that if the boy with the dragon's name stares at a flame, it bends toward him. Is any of this true? It hardly matters. In villages like these, a story that explains fear is already real enough. Now, dim the lights in your mind's little inn, and listen to how their language darkens. They speak of stakes before they have seen a forest of them. They mutter that such a boy will not merely kill, he will pin the world in place like a beetle on a needle. The epithet has not yet been born, but it hovers there, just beyond the candle's edge, Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, a name waiting like an unused nail. Their superstitions knot together. If a glance can pierce, then a name can invite. They teach their children not to speak certain words after dark, not to answer a knock that comes after midnight unless they know the voice, not to stand too long on a threshold where one world bleeds into another. A door is never just wood. It is a thin line between the living and whatever presses against the other side. Safe enough at least to listen, you notice how in these tales social dread and the supernatural share the same cloak. An uninvited guest might be an Ottoman spy, a hungry outlaw, or something older that needs your welcome to step inside. Every rule about hospitality has a shadow rule about survival. Centuries later, in a very different city, another kind of villager will lean over a desk instead of offense. A writer in London will turn the pages of dusty histories, see the word Dracula, and feel that same prickle of possibility the peasants once felt around their fires. He will take the dragon's son and, with a few strokes of ink, move him into a castle where the dead do not stay put and where midnight knocks never come by chance. But between the boy with the dragon's name and the count who crosses oceans, there is still a long road of blood, rumor, and ink to walk. And somewhere along that road, the guest who knocks after midnight will step out of the dark and ask, very softly, to be let in. And somewhere along that road, the guest who knocks after midnight will step out of the dark and ask, very softly, to be let in. Imagine yourself back in the inn bed now, as if waking between one heartbeat and the next. The fire that earlier painted the rafters with bright, leaping gold has sunk low, a bed of coals breathing a dull, secretive red. Shadows climb higher on the walls. Outside, the wind has risen and grown rougher, worrying at the shutters, dragging its cold fingers along the eaves until the whole roof seems to mutter to itself. You lie very still. The storm has its own rhythm now. Gust, rattle, a thin whistle in the chimney. Underneath it, like something remembered rather than heard, those 3 slow knocks still echo in your chest. Once, twice, a third time, patient and deliberate, as if the wood of the door had become a drum for some older, quieter history. Tonight we travel backward, not in miles, but in customs. You recall the innkeeper's voice from earlier in the evening, when the room was warm and the stew still steaming. They had bent close to set down your cup, eyes flicking toward the door with a habit older than they were. Here in this valley, they had murmured, almost to the table, no one answers a knock after midnight, not since the days of the Impaler. Then, with a small wry shrug, as if to soften it into a local joke, rules keep you alive, traveler, or, at least, undisturbed. Names matter. Impaler, Dracula, Prince, Monster. In these lands they hang in the air the way smoke hangs in a low room, clinging to fabric, to stories, to sleep. As you listen to the wind, the centuries in this inn seem to slide over one another like thin sheets of glass. The beam above your head has watched snowfall on Ottoman scouts and Habsburg couriers, on tax collectors with ledgers, on soldiers with mud on their boots. The floorboards remember boots and bare feet, spurs and shackles. In such a place, a knock is never just a sound. It could be a Wallachian official demanding coin, a German merchant seeking shelter, a soldier lost from his regiment, a messenger from the prince, or something that never drew breath at all. It could be the echo of a rider who once came to summon men to Vlad's campaigns, when forests of stakes rose outside Targovishte like a warning written in bodies. Or it could be nothing more and nothing less than the memory of fear itself rehearsing old lines. You find yourself wondering, as any sensible person does in the dark, what would happen if you slid from the bed, padded across the cold floor, and drew back the bolt. Who would be standing there? A weary traveler with snow in their beard, grateful for light and soup? A pale stranger with courtly manners and a ring that once belonged to a long-dead prince? Would they cast a shadow across the threshold, or would the torch in the hallway burn straight through them? Now, dim the lights further in your mind. Picture your own hand reaching for the latch, feeling how the iron holds the night's chill. The rule of the valley presses against your palm. No door after midnight. Rules about thresholds run deep here, where people whisper that the dead and other things cannot cross into a home unless they are invited. Safe enough at least to listen, you tell yourself as your heart keeps time with the wind. Somewhere beyond your door, a floorboard sighs, then another. The soft, measured tread of the innkeeper moves along the corridor, closer, then closer still. The steps pause just outside your room. You can almost see their hand hovering over the latch, torn between habit and curiosity, between the oldest rule of the valley and the oldest weakness of the human heart. The latch does not yet lift. The latch does not yet lift. Instead, the footsteps retreat, leaving you alone with the fire's low murmur and the wind's patient fingers at the shutters. Imagine yourself leaning back once more, the chair creaking softly as the stranger in the corner resumes his tale. Outside, the Carpathian night keeps its own counsel. Inside, a different storm begins. After my father's death, he says, Wallachia became a table where too many hands moved the same pieces. Now dim the lights in your mind and picture it. A narrow principality pressed between kingdoms, its fields still wet with spring thaw, its boyars whispering in stone halls. Vlad Dracula lies dead, his elder son Mircea murdered, and at once the great lords begin to bargain. One faction for a local cousin, another for a pliant youth, each listening for the rustle of Hungarian gold or the distant thunder of Ottoman hooves. Names matter, and the name Dracula is suddenly both a claim and a curse. Hungary eyes the throne as a shield against the advancing sultans. The Ottomans see it as a useful doorway into Christian lands. Wallachia itself, that strip of soil and forest, is treated as a space on a board, not as a home where people plow, pray, and try to sleep through the sound of armies passing by. In this uneasy game, a young Vlad, recently a hostage and not yet the impaler, becomes a piece to be moved. With Ottoman backing, he takes the throne for the first time in the early 1440s. Imagine yourself at Dargovist then, banners snapping in a cold wind, hooves clattering on frozen earth, a thin-faced prince in dark armor riding through a gate that does not yet truly belong to him. His reign is brief, more august than a season. Boyars weigh his foreign patrons, measure his youth, and decide he can be traded away. Within months, he is pushed aside, replaced by a rival more convenient to their purses and to distant courts. The lesson is sharp. Allies vanish like mist when the sun of opportunity rises elsewhere. Foreign powers speak of faith and order, but treat his homeland as a corridor. Local nobles bend whichever way the strongest wind seems to blow. From this, Vlad draws a conviction that will harden into iron. Trust is a luxury for men who do not sit on thrones of daggers. Exiled, he drifts through Moldavia and Transylvania, a prince without a principality, listening more than he speaks. He studies how Moldavian rulers juggle their own Ottoman pressures, how Transylvanian Saxons count profit before loyalty, how every valley has its own grudges and every castle its own quiet betrayals. Tonight we travel with him along snow-packed roads, through pine forests that swallow sound, past villages where shutters close at the mere rumor of his name. He has known captivity as a boy, usurpation as a youth, and now wandering as a man not yet 30. The reign that will make his story echo through centuries has not truly begun, but the shape of it is already there, like a dark tower sketched against lightning. Safe enough at least to listen. You sit by the inn's fire as the guest's voice softens. Power, he murmurs, is never given. It is taken and then defended. Somewhere in the inn, a door finally opens. Another set of footsteps begins to approach. The second set of footsteps pauses just inside the doorway, and for a moment the inn holds its breath. Firelight wavers, shadows lean long across the floor, and you can almost imagine another hall, another gathering, in another century where a different kind of guest has just arrived. Now dim the lights in your mind's eye, and let the crackle of the hearth fade into the distant roll of drums. Tonight we travel to the year 1456, when banners snap above the walls of Targoviste, and the name Dracula returns to Wallachia like a storm coming back over familiar mountains. Names matter, and this one has learned too much in exile to be gentle. Europe, in that moment, trembles. Only 3 years earlier, Constantinople has fallen to the Ottoman cannons, its great dome shuddering under a new crescent banner, and the shock still ripples through every court and village. On the frontier lands between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, Wallachia looks less like a principality and more like a chessboard, where larger powers move pieces and sweep them away at will. Into this uneasy game rides Vlad, no longer the uncertain hostage child, no longer the briefly crowned, quickly ousted prince. Imagine yourself watching from a village roadside as his retinue passes. Iron-helmed riders, foreign mercenaries, local retainers with hard eyes, banners bearing the coiled dragon of his father. He returns with Hungarian backing, but the set of his jaw suggests he intends to owe as few debts as possible. He has come back changed. Harder, yes, but also colder, more calculating, as if the years in Ottoman custody and the memory of his father and brother murdered by their own nobles have burned away any patience for compromise. Wallachia, he decides, will no longer be a plaything of empires, or of its own boyars, those great families who have toppled princes like dice from a cup. So, he invites them to dinner. The story that will be told for centuries begins politely enough. An Easter feast, they say, in Targoviste. Long tables laid with roasted meats and sweetbreads, candles dripping wax, goblets brimming with dark wine. The boyars arrive in their finest furs and embroidered sleeves, expecting flattery, perhaps new favors, perhaps the same old game. Instead, Vlad asks questions. Who served which prince? Who changed sides? Who was present when his father was betrayed, when his brother's eyes were put out and his body cast aside? One by one, the answers tighten like a noose. Then the doors close. Some versions claim he has the older boyars seized on the spot and impaled outside the city walls, their cries rising with the incense of the holy day. Others say he forces the able-bodied noble and servant alike on a brutal forced march to the ruins of Poenari, driving them to rebuild his mountain fortress until many collapse and die on the rocks. Either way, the message is the same. The old order is broken. His supporters later call it justice, a cleansing of corrupt elites who had sold Wallachia to foreign gold and Ottoman threats. His enemies call it madness. Perhaps, in the quiet between heartbeats, even Vlad wonders which it is. But this is only the opening act, because the prince who has purged his own table will soon turn his attention outward, and the lands around him will learn a new language of fear. Forests of stakes, roads lined with the dead, cruelty displayed like a banner on the wind. In the inn, the guest's voice drops to a whisper, and that, he says, was merely the first feast. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, something taps once against the glass, as if asking to be let in. The tapping at the glass fades, swallowed by the wind, and the inn seems to lean closer around you, as if the beams themselves wish to hear what comes next. The guest folds his hands, candlelight catching on his dark eyes, and when he speaks again, his voice is softer, but the words carry a different kind of weight. "Now, dim the lights in your mind," he murmurs, "and imagine yourself far from this warm room. Tonight we travel to a road outside a Wallachian town, where justice is written not in ink, but in wood and silence." He does not rush. He describes, almost clinically, a simple device, a long, sharpened stake, smoothed so that wood can slide through flesh without tearing, raised upright in the earth. A body is placed upon it, not in the swift cruelty of an executioner's sword, but in a slow, deliberate mounting that turns dying into a long, terrible waiting. No need to dwell on the details. It is enough to know that the victim lingers, sometimes for days, and that the true purpose is not the death itself, but the sight of it, along roads, before city gates, on hills that command the valleys. These stakes rise, one, then 10, then hundreds. In time, the people of those lands will give Vlad a new name, Chepish, the Impaler. Names matter. The guest reminds you, because they are stories compressed into a single breath. You shift slightly in your chair as he speaks of the most famous of these displays, the one that later chroniclers would call a Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, as the Ottoman armies pushed toward Targovishte, they found not a welcoming city, but fields transformed into a grim wooden sea. Thousands of stakes, they say, each bearing an Ottoman prisoner, a captured raider, or a Wallachian traitor. Smoke from abandoned villages curled upward, and above it all, this wordless message waited. Imagine yourself a soldier in that column, marching for days, tired, hungry, expecting plunder and glory. Then, suddenly, the horizon changes. Trunks of men instead of trees, flags of silence instead of banners, the stench, the stillness, the buzz of distant carrion birds. You do not need to see every face to understand the sentence written there. Turn back. This was Vlad's chosen language, not treaties, not careful speeches, but scenes arranged like theater. Psychological warfare long before anyone used such a term. For rebellious boyars, for peasants tempted by banditry, for envoys of distant kings, the message was the same. In this small principality, the prince claimed absolute power, and he would spell it out in stakes. Then the guest pauses, tilting his head with a faint wry smile. Or so they say. Here the story itself seems to lean on a cane of old paper. Much of what we know of these forests comes from Saxon pamphlets, printed in German towns that had suffered under Vlad's taxes and raids. Woodcuts showed him dining among the impaled, exaggerated scenes, designed to shock buyers and blacken his name. Later chroniclers copied numbers that grew like shadows at sunset. 10,000. 20,000. More. Did it happen exactly as described? Perhaps not. The truth, the guest suggests, lies somewhere between the stake and the story about the stake. He reminds you, almost gently, that these events sit 5 centuries behind you, filtered through parchment, printing presses, and the imaginations of those who loved or hated this prince. What reaches you tonight is more echo than scream, more shadow than blade. Safe enough, at least, to listen. Outside, the wind claws at the shutters again, but the inn feels steady, held in the cradle of its own age-worn timbers. The guest leans a little closer. If terror was his language, he says, then you should hear how Europe chose to answer. The guest lets that last word hang between you, like smoke above a snuffed candle. For a moment you hear only the wind and the faint crackle of the hearth. Then he smiles, not kindly, not cruelly, and tilts his head. "Names matter," he murmurs, "but so do tables. So do guests. Imagine yourself stepping into a market square in one of Vlad's towns. It is early morning, the stones still wet with mist, the stalls just stirring to life. At the very center stands a fountain, and beside it, gleaming absurdly in the thin light, a great golden cup, not hidden, not guarded, simply waiting. Any hand could take it. And yet, the story says, days passed, then weeks, and no one dared so much as touch its rim. The people drew water, led their oxen through, gossiped in low voices. Eyes flicked to the cup, then away again, as if it might look back. Everyone knew that in these lands there was one law above all. The prince watched. Vlad boasted that under his rule a maiden could walk from one end of Wallachia to the other, with gold at her belt, and come to no harm. The golden cup was his proof, a bright little sun in the square, burning with the shadow of what would happen if it ever went missing. Tonight we travel from that open square to a darker hall. Imagine a long timbered room, smoky with tallow, its benches crowded not with boyars and furs, but with the ragged poor of the countryside, beggars, the lame, the old, the hungry. Vlad, so the tale runs, ordered them brought in, fed them meat and bread and wine until their bellies ached from the shock of plenty. They blessed him, called him merciful. Then he asked if they wished to suffer poverty any longer. "No," they cried, "never again." And so he had the doors barred and the hall set alight. A twisted solution to poverty, some later storytellers say with a shuddering little laugh. Others whisper that this is enemy propaganda, a Saxon nightmare painted in fire. Either way, it clings to him. Hospitality with a hook, a feast that becomes a funeral. Around his table, justice was just as sharp. A merchant who lied about the value of his wares found his goods stolen on the road, then was executed when he complained for trying to cheat both buyer and prince. Officials who skimmed taxes, who took bribes, who let Ottoman raiders slip through for a price, dangled from stakes or ropes as examples no one could ignore. The roads grew safer, the tolls more predictable. Trade, in its grim way, flourished. Some peasants, centuries later, would still tell travelers that under Dracula you could sleep by the roadside with a purse under your head and wake with both intact. Necessary evil, they might mutter, crossing themselves. Monster, protector, dragon, devil's son. Now dim the lights a little in your mind and let that ambiguity settle around you like a cloak. Was this a prince who believed so fiercely in order that he burned and impaled to keep it? Or a sadist who wrapped cruelty in the language of law? The stories do not answer. They only invite you to sit at his table, to feel how close the cup stands to your hand, and to wonder what price you would pay for safety. Outside the inn, the wind drops for a heartbeat, as if the night itself is listening. The guest's fingers tap once on the wood between you, a soft echo of another knock in another century. Of course, he says quietly, Europe did not see his justice the way his peasants did. Let me tell you what they printed. The candle between you gutters, and for a moment the inn's low rafters seem to darken. The guest's eyes catch the flame, and when he speaks again, the room falls away as neatly as a curtain. Now dim the lights in your mind, he murmurs, and imagine yourself on a ridge above Wallachia in the summer of 1462. Night stretches over the plains like a black cloak. Below you, the land glows with an eerie, crawling brightness. Thousands upon thousands of torches wind across the dark fields, a river of fire flowing north. Each spark is a soldier of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, his great Ottoman host pushing into these contested lands, drums like distant thunder, banners like islands of shadow against the stars. The numbers alone feel unreal. Perhaps 90,000 men, perhaps more. A moving city of tents and wagons, horses and cannon, cooks and scribes, imams and janissaries, all advancing toward a smaller, harsher principality that refuses to kneel. History remembers the Sultan as a man of immense power, but tonight the story belongs to a prince who will not yield. Vlad knows he cannot meet that river of fire in open daylight, so he chooses to darken his own land. Villages are emptied and burned, granaries go up in sparks. Fields are slashed, bridges broken, wells fouled with carcasses and lime. Smoke hangs low over the valleys, and the peasants flee into forests and mountains, leaving behind only ash and silence. This is scorched earth not as accident, but as strategy. Disease creeps through the Ottoman camp. Strange fevers, bad water, meat that spoils too quickly in the summer heat. At night, Wallachian horsemen appear and vanish like ghosts, cutting down stragglers, burning outposts, driving off herds. Then they are gone, swallowed by the woods they know as intimately as their own scars. Tonight we travel deeper into that darkness. On the night of June 16th, Vlad gathers a hand-picked force, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 riders. They blacken their armor, muffle their harness, learn the Ottoman passwords from captured scouts. The plan is brutally simple. Slip into the Sultan's vast camp, strike straight for Mehmed's tent, and cut off the head of the invading serpent in a single murderous thrust. Imagine yourself among them as they descend from the hills, hooves thudding softly in the dust, breath steaming in the warm night. Ahead, the Ottoman camp sprawls like a second city, torches flickering, horses stamping, sentries calling in Turkish, Greek, Slavic, the words blurring into a low, uneasy murmur. Then the Wallachians are inside the outer lines, and the night erupts. Tents blaze up like paper lanterns, horses scream and rear, tearing loose from their pickets. Steel clashes in sudden, intimate bursts, blade on armor, blade on bone, punctuated by wild shouts in a dozen tongues as men wake into a nightmare they do not understand. Vlad drives toward the heart of the camp, toward the royal tents, killing as he goes. Yet in the chaos, with banners torn, guide ropes cut, and signals lost in the smoke, he strikes the wrong pavilion. Mehmed lives. Around them, panic becomes a living thing, trampling men beneath hooves, drowning orders in terror. By dawn, the Ottomans still stand, but they have paid dearly. Thousands lie dead or wounded, their camp torn and blackened, their confidence shaken by an enemy who seems willing to ride straight into hell for his homeland. The night attack fails in its narrow goal, yet succeeds in something stranger. It fixes Vlad in the imagination of Europe as a fearless, almost suicidal defender, half hero, half monster. The guest's fingers trace a slow circle on the table, as if following the curve of that river of fire. "Of course," he says softly. The Sultan had not yet seen what waited for him on the road to Targovishte. He looks toward the shuttered window, as if expecting another knock from the dark. "Shall I tell you," he asks, "how a forest learned to grow from human bones? Imagine yourself riding with the great Ottoman host at dawn, the air thick with wood smoke and the sour reek of trampled earth. The banners of Mehmed II roll ahead like waves of colored cloth, drums beating a slow, relentless pulse, and somewhere beyond the morning haze lies Targovist, where a stubborn little frontier prince has dared to set the world on fire. Now, dim the lights in your mind and let the scene sharpen. The road narrows between low hills. Mist curls along the ground, pale as breath in winter. At first, the riders at the front think they see trees ahead, a dark line of trunks and branches clawing at the sky. But as the sun lifts higher, the shapes resolve into something else, not trees, stakes, thousands of them. They stretch for leagues, a man-made forest of sharpened poles, each crowned with a human body in various stages of decay. Some are Ottoman soldiers, uniforms still clinging to them. Some are Wallachian peasants, boyars, prisoners from earlier raids. Birds wheel and settle, then rise again in ragged black clouds. The wind carries the sweet, corrupt smell of death. It is not a battlefield. It is a display. Chronicles written after that summer insist that even hardened janissaries, veterans of sieges and massacres, reined in their horses and fell silent. One account claims that some wept behind their beards, another that men crossed themselves in secret, though they served the Sultan and not the cross. Mehmed himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, is said to have surveyed the forest of the impaled and murmured that it would be hard to take the land of a man who could do such things. Names matter, and by then Dracula no longer meant only son of the dragon. It meant something like, the man who will go further than you dare to imagine. Tonight we travel along that road with him, not as soldiers, but as quiet observers. You notice how the psychological blow lands more cleanly than any sword. The army has marched through scorched villages, poisoned wells, fields stripped bare by Vlad's scorched earth tactics. Disease creeps through the camp. Horses grow thin. Supply wagons lag behind. Every day the land itself seems to withdraw its welcome. And then this, a vision of what capture might mean, spelled out on thousands of stakes. On a map, Mehmed's campaign looks like power advancing. In the saddle, under that smell, it feels like power hesitating. The Sultan pushes on a little further, skirmishes, burns, calculates. But the combination of hunger, sickness, and the weight of that terrible forest bends even his will. In the end, he chooses to withdraw rather than grind his army to pieces in a haunted, hostile principality that yields no easy prize. News of this stand travels faster than any caravan. In the courts of Hungary and Poland, the story arrives wrapped in both horror and a kind of grim admiration. A Christian prince who has bloodied the great Ottoman Empire, though by methods that make even allies shudder. Pamphlets will soon embroider the tale, woodcuts will carve those stakes into the eyes of Europe, and the name Dracula will begin its long journey through centuries of shadow. Yet as one enemy turns back from Targovista, others move quietly into place. Exiled boyars whisper in foreign halls. Rival claimants weigh their chances. Even Vlad's powerful Hungarian patron watches with narrowed eyes. Safe enough at least to listen from our inn tonight, you can feel it. While the forest of the impaled still sways in the wind, the roots of his downfall are already spreading beneath his feet. The wind outside our inn still smells of smoke and snow, but the forest of the impaled is already fading into memory. Power never dies in one great blow. It thins, it frays, and then, at the border, someone simply closes a door. Tonight we travel not through battlefields, but through council chambers and guarded gates, where betrayal wears velvet and speaks Latin. Imagine yourself following Vlad's retreating shadow northward, away from Wallachia, toward the lands of his great Christian patron, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. This was the prince who had once armed him, blessed his campaign against the Ottoman advance, and praised him as a shield of Christendom. Names matter, and Ali is a comforting one. But in this corner of 15th century history, it can change faster than the mountain weather. Europe at this moment trembles between fear of the Sultan and fatigue with endless crusades. Matthias feels pressure from all sides. Nobles weary of paying for frontier wars, Saxon merchants furious at Vlad's burnings, foreign envoys whispering of atrocities. The same pamphlets and woodcuts that turned Vlad into a media monster in German towns now drift into royal libraries, each lurid scene another excuse to step back from so troublesome a friend. So when Vlad, driven out by a rival and Ottoman counterattack, crosses into Hungarian reach, he comes not as a triumphant prince but as a supplicant. He seeks soldiers, silver, perhaps one more chance at his throne. Instead, at a quiet frontier stronghold, the welcome hardens. Imagine the moment, a courtyard of packed snow, horses steaming in the cold, mailed hands resting a little too firmly on sword hilts as royal officers step forward with orders already signed. Vlad is seized, not in the chaos of battle, but in the stillness of procedure. No shouted accusations, only formal words of custody and the rustle of parchment. In an instant, the man who built forests of the impaled becomes a piece of royal property, escorted away to castles and fortresses deep inside Hungary. He will spend years there, not as a ruling prince, but as a guarded guest who is never allowed to leave. To justify this quiet coup, Matthias produces letters, convenient letters. They claim to show Vlad offering to betray Christian lands to the Ottoman Sultan, to switch sides once more for his own gain. Many historians suspect they were forged, crafted to soothe Western powers and the Pope himself. Look, the king can say, I have caged a traitor. I am no ally of monsters. Now dim the lights for a different kind of horror, not blood, but waiting. Vlad paces stone corridors, hears mass in chapel naves, learns the rhythm of locked doors and counted keys. Seasons turn over the Danube, snow, thaw, harvest, snow again. His enemies at home write their own story in his absence, while in far-off printing houses, his legend grows taller, stranger, darker. Safe enough at least to listen. You can almost hear his boots on the flagstones, the scrape-scrape of a caged man measuring walls with each step. What happens to a prince whose power rested on visible terror when he becomes unseen, hidden behind foreign stone? In that long captivity, does Vlad the Impaler fade? Or does something colder and more enduring begin to take his place, waiting for the night and the moment when a door finally opens? The door of Vlad's Hungarian cell opens only for guards and jailers, yet outside those walls, another kind of door is swinging wide, not of oak and iron, but of paper and ink. While the prince walks his narrow circle in the dark, his shadow begins to travel, thin and flat, across Europe. Imagine yourself not in a dungeon now, but in a chilly German workshop around 1460. The room smells of oil, damp wood, and metal. Blocks of type lie sorted in cases. Sheets hang like pale flags from lines. This is the new magic of the age. The printing press, turning slow, hand-copied chronicles into stacks of identical pages that can ride in saddlebags and wagons to distant lands. Stories once whispered by a fire can suddenly gallop faster than any horse Tonight, we travel with one of those stories as it takes shape under the hands of Saxon printers. Names matter, and to the German-speaking merchants of Transylvanian towns, the name Dracula no longer means a prince guarding a dangerous frontier. It means tariffs raised, caravans seized, guild privileges trampled, and a ruler who will not bow to their economic power. They have lost coin and influence in Wallachia, and they intend to be repaid in reputation. So they sharpen their pens into stakes. In their pamphlets and chronicles, Vlad becomes not just harsh, but monstrous. You read of banquet halls where guests who displease him are suddenly found hoisted on stakes, the feast continuing beneath their dangling feet. You see woodcuts of cauldrons and flames, of victims supposedly boiled or roasted for petty crimes. There are tales of hats nailed to heads for failing to show proper respect, of a golden cup left in a public square that no one dares steal, because the punishment is too terrible to imagine. Now dim the lights in your mind for a moment, and notice how these tales work. The details are lurid, but strangely repetitive, like a litany. Impalement, boiling, mutilation, always in great numbers, always with the same moral. Here is a barbaric tyrant at the edge of Christendom, a man whose cruelty proves that trade with his lands is perilous and resistance is justified. These are not neutral reports, they are warning labels. For some of Vlad's own subjects, especially peasants weary of corrupt boyars, such severity could look like rough justice, even a kind of order. Yet on the printed page, that ambiguity vanishes. The Saxon grievances are flattened into simple horror. Safe enough at least to listen, you can watch how propaganda moves. The pamphlets are cheap, the woodcuts striking, the Latin and German phrases easy to copy. Princes at court, clerics in cloisters, merchants in counting houses, all encounter the same image, a bloodthirsty Wallachian ruler whose cruelty eclipses even the Ottoman threat. By the time Vlad dies, his body lost and his grave uncertain, the paper version of him is already larger than life. The man has been killed, restored, imprisoned, perhaps killed again. The printed monster never dies. It lingers in chronicles, in cabinets of curiosities, in the back of the European mind, waiting for a later century, and for another writer to open that old pamphlet, see the name Dracula, and imagine something even darker stepping out of the ink. And as that ink-dark monster lingers on the page, you feel the inn around you slowly swim back into focus, as if someone has gently closed a book between one breath and the next. The crackle of the hearth returns first, then the low murmur of voices, the faint rattle of a window touched by wind and snow. Imagine yourself once more in the common room, wrapped in the amber circle of firelight, while the corners of the inn stay stubbornly shadowed. Outside, the storm still prowls along the eaves. Somewhere beyond these walls lies the road, the forest, and that unanswered memory of 3 slow knocks after midnight. Safe enough at least to listen, the innkeeper decides that if the night insists on telling stories, he might as well choose which one. He clears his throat, leans an elbow on the worn oak table, and lets his gaze travel around the circle. Merchants with damp cloaks steaming by the fire. A pair of travelers from distant lands, boots crusted with old snow. Local farmers with hands like knotted roots, their eyes bright and tired. All of them tilt a little closer as he says, almost casually, "You have heard of Vlad Tepes. Some call him Dracula." Names matter. The word hangs in the air like smoke. A few listeners cross themselves. One of the merchants smiles too quickly, as if to prove he is not afraid. Yet everyone leans in. Tonight we travel, not along the road to Brasov or Bystritsa, but back through centuries, down into a time when a Wallachian prince fought in the shadow of the Ottoman frontier and left forests of the impaled behind him. The innkeeper's version is stitched from many threads. He has seen the German pamphlets, or at least heard them retold, with their woodcut horrors of a ruler dining among steaks and corpses. But he also knows the softer, colder stories that never reached any printing press. Riders glimpsed on misty roads where no hoofbeats sound. A pale figure at an upstairs window of the ruined fortress, watching the village lamps go out one by one. A prince killed and killed again, yet always somehow still riding. He speaks of Vlad as both tyrant and dark guardian, a man whose cruelty held worse terrors at bay. His voice dips lower as he explains how the grave was lost, how the bones were moved, or perhaps never found at all. Is it any wonder, he suggests with a wry half-smile, that some say the restless dead still bargain for shelter when the snow is deepest? You sit among them, feeling the heat of the fire on your face, the cool draft at your back, aware of every breath in the room. Yet part of you floats just above the scene, watching it as if from the rafters. You hear the tale as history and as bedtime legend, as printed propaganda, and as the sort of story whispered to children who will pretend not to dream of it. Now, dim the lights in your mind and notice how the inn itself seems to listen. The beams creak softly. The shutters shiver. The innkeeper is just reaching the darkest turn. Speaking of a winter when a stranger came late to an inn like this, demanding to be invited across the threshold, when it happens, 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Not at the distant outer door this time, but close. Wood answering bone just beyond the common room. The story stops in mid-breath. For a long moment no one moves. The inn itself seems to hold its breath, as if the beams and stones remember other winters, other knocks. Then, as the sound fades and the storm resumes its muttering, the innkeeper clears his throat and, instead of going to the door, goes back into the story, but to a different kind of prison. Imagine yourself now not in this warm common room, but in a narrower space, a chamber with thick walls, a slit of window, and iron that smells faintly of rust and old rain. Tonight we travel from the creaking rafters of the inn to the long, slow years when Vlad, once a restless frontier prince, found himself caged. His captivity was not a single simple cell. At times, sources suggest, he endured harsh confinement in the depths of Hungarian fortresses, stone-sweating in winter, heat-trapped and airless in summer, guards' boots echoing in corridors that never quite fell silent. At other times the walls softened, house arrest in a noble residence, perhaps, with a bed, a hearth, even a view of gardens he could not walk in. Comfort, yes, but the kind that tastes like someone else's mercy. In those in-between years, his true prison was his own mind. Names matter, and the man called Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil, had ample time to replay the scenes that had carved his legend. Imagine the long nights, battles fought again and again behind closed eyes, the night attack at Targoviste restaged in the dark, the forests of the impaled standing once more in the cold dawn of memory. He would remember betrayals, too. Boyars who smiled at his table and whispered against him an hour later. Saxon merchants nursing grudges that would spill into printed pamphlets, turning him into Europe's favorite monster of the month. In that narrow room, he could argue with ghosts, justify each stake, each burned village, as necessary in a brutal world where the Ottoman border pressed like a thumb on the throat of his lands. There are accounts that, during these years, Vlad leaned more deeply into Christian piety. He is said to have attended Mass, to have knelt where once he only commanded others to kneel. Perhaps he hoped for redemption. Perhaps he sought only respectability in the eyes of his Hungarian captors. A prince turned penitent looks less dangerous after all. Candlelight on stone, Latin murmured low, the sign of the cross traced by a hand that had once signed death warrants. Outside his walls, the map kept shifting. History does not pause for any one man, even a feared one. The Ottoman power continued to swell, rivers of soldiers and silver flowing toward the heart of Europe. Hungarian rulers, ever practical, began to look again at their difficult guest and see not a criminal, but a possible weapon, a man who knew Ottoman tactics, Ottoman minds, and how to make fear itself ride before his banners. And yet, for Vlad, these were the years of a kind of living death, a figure defined by motion, by sudden raids and midnight decisions, reduced to pacing the same few steps. The legend outside grew sharper even as the man inside aged, his edges worn by time, his presence turning, little by little, from flesh into rumor. Safe enough at least to listen, you and I can stand at the edge of that dim chamber and watch him become something quieter, more spectral in the imagination of those who spoke his name. When he finally emerges, he will be older, yes, but also half-ghost already, perfectly prepared to step from history into nightmare. And somewhere, far from his walls, another knock will sound, asking to be let in. He steps out of that dim chamber and into the open air once more, and you can almost hear the creak of old armor as the ghost becomes a prince again. Imagine yourself watching from a snowy ridge as banners stir in a thin winter wind, their colors faded, their promise uncertain. Tonight we travel to his last ascent. History calls it Vlad's third reign, but it is more like the final flare of a candle that has already burned itself nearly to the wick. The lands around him are no calmer than before. Wallachia still lies between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, a narrow, trampled threshold where armies pass, where treaties are written in the next and broken in the next. Names matter in this story of shifting loyalties. It is Hungarian power that lifts him once more, Matthias Corvinus and his allies deciding that the old wolf is still useful, still frightening enough to point toward the Ottoman frontier. With their backing, and with a small hardened following, Vlad is restored to the Wallachian throne, not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a grim, necessary tool. Now, dim the lights and picture his capital. The streets are quieter than before, the boyars more cautious, the peasants watching from doorways. This is not the roaring reign of 1456. This is an older man in a region even more exhausted, where every rider on the horizon might be a tax collector, a rebel, or an Ottoman scout. His power is real, but it trembles. It flickers. His enemies have not forgotten. Rival claimants, some with Ottoman favor, some with local support, hover like crows along the borders. Discontented boyars whisper in halls that once echoed with screams, and beyond the Danube the Ottomans watch carefully, unwilling to tolerate a resurgent Vlad who has already filled their nightmares with forests of the impaled. He stands in the center of a tightening ring, steel on every side. So the end comes as it always threatened to, in battle. Around 1476, somewhere in the cold confusion near Bucharest, or along the road toward Snagov, the lines clash, and the prince who ruled by fear meets the oldest fear of all. Chroniclers disagree on the details. Some say he was cut down by enemies disguised as allies. Others murmur that his own men struck him by mistake in the chaos of the charge, a dark little irony the centuries were never going to resist. What happened to his body is even less certain. One tale insists his head was severed, salted, and sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople, proof that the troublesome Wallachian was finally quiet. Another suggests a burial at the monastery on Snagov Island under stone and candle smoke. Yet when archaeologists opened a supposed grave centuries later, the bones did not match the man. And so the grave of Vlad Dracula remains a question mark, a gap in the earth where a body should be. Safe enough at least to listen, you can feel how that uncertainty invites another kind of answer, one whispered in inns and at midnight doors. If he was never truly found, then perhaps he was never truly laid to rest. And perhaps, somewhere in the snow, someone is still walking toward a lonely inn, ready to knock. So the grave is empty or uncertain, and the snow outside the inn door still remembers a traveler who may or may not have arrived. Imagine yourself staying another night in these lands, listening as the wind prowls around the eaves, and realizing that when a man like Vlad vanishes from the earth, he does not simply disappear. He lingers, not in flesh, but in stories. In Wallachia and the neighboring valleys, the people kept him. Around hearths and in wine-sour taverns, they told how the prince had punished thieves by impalement, how he had nailed hats to the heads of arrogant envoys, how a golden cup once stood at a town fountain and no one dared steal it. Some spoke with a kind of harsh admiration, as if his cruelty had been a terrible medicine that nonetheless kept order. Others spat the name, remembering forests of stakes and rivers that ran thick and dark. Now, dim the lights in your mind and step for a moment into a monastery scriptorium where the chill of stone presses through a monk's thin robe. Quills scratch, candles gutter. In Latin and Church Slavonic, chroniclers set down Vlad's deeds with the solemn patience of men weighing souls. One line praises him as a defender of the faith against the Ottoman tide, the next condemns him as a sinner of such magnitude that only God could measure it. In those narrow columns of ink, he becomes both sword and scourge, a necessary evil and an unnecessary horror. Out in the villages, though, parchment mattered less than whispers. People said that on certain nights a rider could be seen on the ridge, horse black against a paler sky, watching the road where tax collectors once trembled. Children were warned about a stern figure who waited at crossroads after dark, demanding a toll in coin, in promise, or, if the storyteller was feeling particularly dramatic, in courage itself. Crossroads, after all, belong as much to the dead as to the living. Names matter, and his became more than a memory. In some cottages, mothers hissed Dracula to still quarrels or stop a hand from reaching toward mischief, as if the very word were a raised switch. In others, the same name was muttered like a charm when wolves howled or bandits were rumored nearby. The logic being simple and rather wry: call upon a greater terror to frighten the lesser ones away. A curse and a protection, carried on the same breath. Tonight we travel not just through space, but through centuries. As empires shifted and new princes rose and fell, these tales thinned, frayed, and, in some regions, nearly faded. Yet they never quite died. A traveler would note a curious legend here, a scholar would copy a passage there, and slowly the shadow of Vlad stretched beyond the Carpathians. The next time you see a Victorian gentleman in a London library, remember that he may be hunting not ghosts, but footnotes. For in a later age, far from these snow-muted villages, a rider leafing through old chronicles and travelogues would find the name Dracula, feel its weight, and decide that this prince of stakes and empty graves had not finished walking through history just yet. Tonight we travel far from the snow-muted villages and into another kind of darkness, the fog-softened glow of 19th century London. Imagine yourself walking along the Thames embankment, as gas lamps hiss in the damp air, their halos swallowed by coal smoke, while the great city dreams uneasy dreams of empire, contagion, and strangers arriving from distant lands. The streets are crowded, yet somehow lonely. Horse-drawn cabs rattle over slick cobblestones, newsboys shout of wars in far-off Ottoman provinces, and in drawing rooms people whisper about anarchists, foreign princes, and strange Eastern customs. History for them is not safely buried. It arrives in ships and steam trains, carrying accents, diseases, and ideas that seem to seep under the door like a draft. In this London, the east of Europe is both alluring and unsettling, a half-known region of mountains, monasteries, and rumored horrors. Now, dim the lights in your mind and follow one man up the stone steps of the British Museum Reading Room. Bram Stoker, theater manager by day and restless researcher by night, moves beneath the great dome into a circle of gas-lit desks. Around him, scholars cough softly, pages rustle, and the dust of centuries hangs in the air. He is hunting a story, and, like our earlier chroniclers, he is willing to chase it through footnotes. Stoker pores over travelogues from Transylvania, accounts of wolves and mountain passes, of superstitions about the restless dead who must not be invited across the threshold. He reads histories of frontier princes who fought the Ottoman advance, of Wallachia and its brutal rulers. In one such volume he finds a name that seems to glow on the page, as if inked in a darker shade of black. Dracula. Names matter, and this one catches at him. In his early notes, Stoker had considered calling his vampire Count Wampir, a name more quaint than terrifying, almost wry. But as he traces references to a Wallachian prince, Vlad, son of Dracula, and sees the word explained as son of the dragon or son of the devil, something clicks. Dracula feels heavier, older, as if it carries the echo of battlefields and impaled enemies. He quietly crosses out one name and writes in another. A small change on paper, a vast shift in shadow. Yet Stoker borrows selectively. He takes the name, the Transylvanian setting, a hint of forests and crumbling castles, but he does not retell the life of Vlad Tepes. Instead, he relocates and reshapes, turning a medieval frontier prince into an immortal aristocratic predator who moves with ease from mountain pass to London townhouse. The historical ruler who impaled enemies becomes a count who pierces throats. The battlefield becomes the bedroom and the bloodline. In doing so, Stoker pours very Victorian fears into this old vessel. His Dracula is an invader who crosses seas and borders, bringing a tainted blood into the heart of the empire. He is foreign, seductive, and diseased all at once, a figure through whom London can imagine its anxieties about sexuality, about contagion, about the collapse of old certainties. When you watch him step ashore in the novel, you can almost hear the city's nervous heartbeat. And somewhere between those gaslit desks and the printed pages of 1897, the Prince of Wallachia finishes his long journey from history into nightmare. But how did readers first meet this new Dracula? And why did so many feel, with a shiver, that he had been waiting for them all along? Now, dim the lights for a moment and imagine yourself back at that gas-lit desk in 1897, the ink still drying on the word Dracula. Names matter, and this one carries a long iron taste with it. Somewhere behind the Count's courteous bow, the shadow of a Wallacian prince is still watching. Stoker did not pick the name by accident. His notebooks show him stumbling upon Dracula and scribbling down that it meant devil. But behind that note stands Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracula of the Order of the Dragon, a ruler whose lands lay between Transylvania and the Ottoman frontier. Both the historical prince and the fictional count are ruthless, strategic, and patient, men who turn fear itself into a weapon. Vlad raises forests of the impaled to break an invading army's spirit. Dracula sends wolves, mists, and storms to unnerve the little band of English intruders. Tonight we travel along that thin line where continuity blurs into invention. The real Vlad is very much a creature of his time, a Christian warlord in a brutal borderland, his cruelty framed as harsh justice by some, monstrous excess by others. Stoker's Dracula keeps the iron will, the taste for terror, the association with bloodshed, but he slips them into a different skin. The prince who once fought the Ottomans becomes a being who fights death itself, trading the battlefield for the bedroom, the open stake field for the private throat. Stoker's great transformation is to take political power and turn it into metaphysical hunger. Vlad's executions serve purposes of control, revenge, and deterrence. Dracula's killings are not judicial, they are sustenance. He is immortal, where Vlad is mortal, shape-shifting where Vlad is simply cunning, dissolving into mist, bat or wolf, sliding down castle walls like a lizard, crossing seas and boxes of earth. The stake that once symbolized Vlad's rule becomes, in a darkly playful reversal, the very instrument that can finally end the count. To make this work, Stoker also rearranges the map. The historical Vlad's power base lies in Wallachia, south of the Carpathians, with Transylvania as only part of his story. Yet the novel plants Dracula's castle deep in a remote, almost unreachable Transylvania. Cliffs, gorges, blue mountains, and whispering pine forests blend Saxon, Hungarian, and Romanian traditions into one great Gothic stage. Geography becomes mood. The lands themselves seem to lean inward, listening. There is another change, quieter, but just as important, the moral frame. Vlad's world is one where impalement, flaying, and burning are grimly common across empires. His brutality is extreme, but it exists within a shared language of terror. Dracula, by contrast, is cast as something older and colder, a predator moving through drawing rooms and bedchambers, a violation of order rather than its savage guardian. He is not merely a cruel ruler. He is an intrusion from outside the moral universe of the heroes. And at the threshold between those universes stands a door. In many Eastern European tales, no restless dead thing may cross into your home unless invited. Stoker seizes that older belief and turns it into a Victorian obsession with boundaries. Doors, windows, train compartments, even the body itself. Dracula must be welcomed into houses, into hearts, into nations, his evil requiring a tiny act of consent. It is the same unease that clings to our inn tonight, where a knock after midnight is never just a knock. When you hear that sound in these stories, you are not simply opening to a stranger. You are deciding which world you wish to live in. In a moment, we'll return to that lonely door in the snowbound inn, and to the guest who claims he has crossed centuries to explain himself. But first, it is worth asking, If you heard that soft, deliberate knocking, would you answer? Perhaps you felt it just then, when the question hung in the air like breath in winter. Would you answer? That small shiver along the spine is why Dracula keeps returning century after century, still knocking, still waiting on the threshold between safety and surrender. Imagine yourself listening to that knock, knowing that on the other side stands a stranger who is not entirely a stranger. He is every worry you have ever had about who you let into your home, your body, your thoughts. In older villages, people feared the guest who brought plague on his cloak or heresy in his stories. Today, the stranger may arrive through a glowing screen rather than a creaking door, but the unease is the same. Something from outside wishes to cross the border and live inside you. Names matter, and the name Dracula gathers these fears the way a storm cloud gathers snow. In the medieval borderlands where our prince first rode, people watched the horizon for Ottoman banners and for raiders slipping through mountain passes. A rider at night might mean taxes, war, or disappearance. Later, when early printed pamphlets spread tales of Lad the Impaler, the horror shifted. Now the fear was that power itself could become monstrous, that a ruler might drink the lifeblood of his own people and call it justice. By the time we reach the Victorian age, the figure has changed clothes, but not nature. Silk-lined cloaks replace battered armor. London streets replace Wallachian forests, and the anxiety turns inward toward desire and disease. Dracula becomes the seducer in the darkened parlor, the foreign count whose bite suggests both forbidden pleasure and invisible infection. In our own time, cinema gives him yet another mask, sometimes romantic, sometimes feral, always crossing borders, national, bodily, spiritual, with a smile that is never entirely reassuring. And yet, curiously, we invite him back. Tonight we travel through versions of this story that are almost cozy in their dread, where candlelight is warm, the bed is soft, and the worst of the terror has been smoothed into legend. By telling and retelling the tale, we place the monster at a manageable distance. We tuck him between book covers, behind a movie screen, inside a whispered bedtime story that is, somehow, safe enough at least to listen. Now, dim the lights in your imagination and think quietly about your own thresholds, the doors you lock at night, the habits you open like windows, the relationships and stories and late-night thoughts you grant permission to enter. Each is a kind of border post, where you, like a wary innkeeper, decide who may step inside and who must remain out in the snow. Tonight, all these centuries of fear and fascination have taken on a single shape. They stand together in the drifting white outside, one wooden door, in one lonely inn, at one impossible hour. The knocking has begun again. Slow, patient, certain, and the latch is trembling as if it already knows which way you will decide. The latch shivers once, then stills. The fire sighs, and then you hear it again. 3 knocks, a third time, unhurried, spaced like measured heartbeats against the wood. Not demanding, not pleading, simply certain. As if whoever waits beyond the door has already lived through centuries of winter nights and can afford to be patient for one more. Imagine yourself standing there, close enough that you feel each knock travel through the grain. The whole door gives a faint, slow tremor, and that shiver runs into your fingertips, up your arm into the soft place at the base of your throat. The wood does not crash or rattle. It hums like a low note on a distant drum. Around you, the inn seems to lean in to listen. The wind outside, so loud a moment ago, falls away into a muffled hush As if the snow itself is holding its breath, the rafters stop creaking. Even the old clock in the corner misses a beat. Only the fire moves, its flames tilting toward the sound, narrowing, lengthening, as though drawn by an unseen tide under the door. Now dim the lights in your mind's eye and notice the small things. The iron latch, cold and black, quivers with each gentle impact. The candle on the counter gutters, then steadies its flame, bending toward the door as if listening for a familiar voice. Somewhere far off, a wolf gives a single, uncertain howl and then thinks better of it. The innkeeper's hand hovers over the latch. He is a practical man, rooted in these lands where history and superstition share the same narrow roads. But tonight his fingers will not quite close. He remembers other stories told by other fires, of travelers who opened their doors after midnight and were never seen by morning, of guests who crossed a threshold uninvited and left only a smear of shadow behind. Names matter, the old women always said, tracing circles in spilled grain. Learn the names of saints, and you may be saved. Learn the names of those who walk after death, and you may at least know whom to fear. But the innkeeper has not given his name tonight. He is sure of that. And then, through the wood, a voice, low, formal. The kind of voice that might once have spoken in courts, or commanded soldiers on a dark frontier where Ottoman banners pressed at the borders. It does not shout. It does not whisper. It simply arrives in the room, smooth and grave, as if it has every right to be here. Good host, it says, grant me shelter from the snow. The innkeeper's breath catches. The voice continues, a little closer, as though its lips now rest against the keyhole. Open the door, Mihai. The name is his. He has not heard it spoken in that tone for many years. He has not given it to any stranger tonight. Your own skin prickles, because when the voice speaks again, the syllables change. They twist, soften, and fall into a shape that is almost impossibly your name. Close enough that for a heartbeat, the story turns its face toward you. Open the door, the guest says gently, speaking that near-perfect version of who you are. I have come so far, and you are safe enough at least to listen. You do not open the door. Instead, something older than manners stirs in you, the faint remembered warning that in these lands a door at midnight is not just wood and iron. It is a boundary, a line in the snow and in the soul. Now, dim the lights in your mind for a moment, and step back from our inn, from our mysterious guest, and from that almost perfect version of your name. Imagine yourself standing inside a small village house somewhere in the Carpathians centuries ago. The shutters are barred, the fire is low, and every crack in the wall has been stuffed with rags against the winter. Outside, wolves cry and the wind claws at the eaves. But the true danger, people whisper, comes when someone knocks after midnight. For in much of Eastern Europe, a house is not simply shelter. It is a small fortress of consent. Here, stories say that certain beings cannot cross the threshold unless you invite them. Vampires with their hungry patience, wandering spirits still wearing the shapes of the dead, witches who travel in storms and smoke, all of them must wait until a living voice says, "Come in." To lift the latch, to draw back the bolt, to speak that welcome aloud is to perform a tiny ritual of power. You grant passage. You share your breath, your warmth, your life. Crossroads too, and certain hours of the night are treated with wary respect. Midnight is not merely a time on a clock. It is a seam, a place where one day has ended and the next has not quite begun. The living and the dead, the human and the inhuman, the remembered and the forgotten, are believed to brush against one another there, at crossroads, where roads argue over which way the traveler should go, or by border rivers that belong fully to neither bank. The world feels thin. Tonight we travel, in imagination, through those in-between spaces where a careless greeting might be all the invitation a restless thing requires. So people arm their thresholds, a cross scratched on the doorframe with a bit of charcoal, salt sprinkled in a pale, defiant line across the sill, garlic hung in braids, iron keys nailed above the entrance, a knife-turned blade outward under the mat. These are small, stubborn gestures that say, "We see you, whatever you are, and you may stay out in the snow." Names matter, and so do rules. On the surface, these customs seem purely supernatural, but they also kept families alive. If your children know that no good soul knocks after midnight, they are less likely to open to bandits, deserters, or plague-ridden strangers. A story of vampires at the door is easier to remember than a lecture on epidemiology, and far more persuasive when the wind is howling. In Vlad's Wallachia, the fear of the door was sharpened by politics. A midnight knock might mean Ottoman scouts, a tax collector with soldiers at his back, or an informant dragging you into some prince's quarrel. To refuse to open was to risk offense. To open was to risk everything else. And in that tension, between safety and obedience, between guest right and survival, the legend of a certain patient, nocturnal visitor found fertile ground. Our innkeeper knows all this. So do you now. As the knocking returns, soft and impossibly polite, and the guest outside waits for a word that might change the rest of the night. The innkeeper hesitates only a heartbeat longer. Then wood answers knuckles. The latch lifts with a small, decisive click that sounds far louder than it should in the sleeping house. The door sighs inward, and at once the room is broken open to the night. Cold rushes in like a living thing, shouldering past you and the innkeeper, spilling across the floorboards. Snowflakes wheel and tumble through the gap, bright against the dark, caught for a moment in the lamplight before they die on the warm, smoky air. The fire gutters drawing breath, as if even the flames are startled. Imagine yourself standing just behind the innkeeper's shoulder. You feel the sting of the wind on your face, smell wet wool, wood smoke, and that faint iron tang that comes whenever snow has fallen hard on old roofs and older roads. Beyond the threshold, the world is only shapes, the blurred outline of a carriage, the suggestion of horses steaming in the dark, the long black ribbon of the road disappearing into unknown lands. And there, framed in the doorway, stands the guest. He is tall, though not impossibly so, pale, though not corpse-pale. His clothing is outdated but carefully kept, as if he has stepped forward from a painting rather than from the snow. A dark coat with a high collar, brushed clean of frost. A tunic cut in an old Wallachian fashion, its fastenings neat, its cloth thick and practical, the sort a frontier prince might have worn when the Ottomans pressed hard at his borders. The faint scent that comes with him is not of grave earth, but of old leather, horse sweat long since dried, and iron that has remembered too many winters. On his hand, a signet ring catches the firelight. The metal is worn smooth at the edges, but the device is still clear. A coiled dragon, wings half spread, as if guarding something you cannot see. Names matter, and somewhere in the back of your mind the old associations stir. Dracula, son of the dragon, A thin, pale scar crosses his throat, almost hidden by the shadow of his collar. Another, narrower, marks the back of his hand, the sort of line steel leaves when it glances instead of bites. His face is not the mask of a monster, but of a tired man who has forgotten how long he has been awake. His eyes, when they lift to meet yours, seem to hold centuries. "Forgive the hour," he says at last, and his words fall into the room like something translated from another age. The phrasing is oddly formal, the rhythms more 15th century than modern, as if he has learned your language from a very old book and never quite updated his vocabulary. I would not trespass were the night less insistent. Is he ghost, vampire, dream, or simply a traveler who looks too much like those woodcut portraits of Vlad Tepes, stern and mustached, that once glared from cheap pamphlets? The innkeeper does not ask, nor do you. There are some questions that feel like doors in themselves. He steps fully inside, and the temperature seems to rise just enough to be bearable. The door closes. The wind's howl softens to a muffled murmur, and the inn is once more a small, flickering world, safe enough at least to listen. "I seek no blood," the stranger says quietly, as if he has had to clarify this before. "Only a listener. Tonight we travel through a long history, if you will permit it. Before dawn, I would tell my side of the story. You may sit by the fire, wakeful or drifting, as pleases you. Only remain until I have finished." He turns his gaze to you, not the innkeeper. "Will you keep the watch with me," he asks, "while the rest of the house sleeps?" Outside, something unseen moves in the snow. Inside, the flame steadies, and the night waits to hear what you will say. The inn answers for you before your tongue can move. A board creaks upstairs, a sleeper shifts, and then the house sinks into that special quiet where no one speaks, yet no one truly sleeps. The other guests turn on their pallets, faces toward the wall, blankets pulled high, not resting, listening. Safe enough at least to listen, they seem to decide, as the candles gutter and draw long, trembling shadows up the beams. The wind presses its palm against the shutters. Somewhere a log collapses in the hearth with a sigh, and the stranger settles into the chair where long ago the innkeeper first told you tales of a Wallachian prince named Dracula. "Names matter," he says softly. "They are banners and burdens. I was born among both." He leans forward, and the flame lifts to meet him. "I was a child of daggers and banners, of oaths spoken over iron. Imagine yourself waking not to birdsong, but to the clatter of armor in the courtyard, to the hiss of servants whispering which neighbor had changed allegiance in the night. My cradle stood in a fortress where maps were never finished, because borders bled and moved like wounds that would not close. I was my father's son, Dracula, the dragon. So they called me Dracula, the dragon's whelp, the devil's child if they were feeling brave. Tonight we travel, you and I, back to the years when that name was still only a promise and not yet a curse. I learned my letters in Wallachia, but I learned fear in the Ottoman court. A hostage, they called it, as if the word were a polite cloak thrown over a naked blade. I watched men bow with their lips and hate with their eyes. I learned their language, their prayers, their punishments. Impalement was there long before it was mine. I only perfected what I had seen. His gaze drifts past you, to centuries you can only imagine. When I returned to rule, I found not a country, but a carcass. Boyars who had murdered my father, neighbors who smiled to my face and wrote to the Sultan behind my back, Tell me, traveler from another age, what speech would such men heed? I chose the language they had taught me, terror. I raised forests of stakes along the roads where traitors and invaders swayed together. I made examples, cruel and clear. They say I did it for pleasure. No. The pleasure, if there was any, lay in the silence that followed, in villages that could sleep because raiders hesitated at the border. Bess. He pauses. The candle licks at its own wax, as if uneasy. Yet, he murmurs, there are nights when I walk again between those stakes in dreams. I know each face. Some deserved worse. Some did not. The wind there has a sound I do not like to remember. Slowly, he turns back to you, as though aware of the thin thread of time that separates your chair from his. You, who sit in a quieter world, would you have ruled differently, standing where I stood, with the Ottomans at your throat, and your own nobles at your spine? Or would you too have spoken in the only tongue they seemed willing to understand? Outside, the snow shifts. Inside, the question hangs, bright and fragile as the last drop of wax on the candle's edge. The guest does not answer his own question at once. His gaze drifts past you to the window where the snow presses its white face against the glass, and when he speaks again, his voice is softer, almost amused. They argued about me, he says, even while I still breathed. My enemies in the Saxon towns carved me into wood and ink, little black forests of stakes, little screaming mouths, sold in markets for a few coins. Pamphlets, they call them now. Thin paper, thin truth. He tilts his head. My allies were no better. They made ballads, brave prince, scourge of the Ottoman, defender of the cross. They sang my name over wine until it floated away like steam. Imagine yourself holding one of those crackling sheets, the ink still sharp, the wood-cut prints frozen mid-impalement. Then picture a smoky hall where a blind singer plucks at strings and chants of a just ruler who punishes the wicked. Same man, same deeds. Two different ghosts walking through history. Names matter, he murmurs, almost to the candle. To some I was Dracula, son of the dragon, a shield between their fields and the Sultan. To others, I was only the impaler, a shadow with a crown. Neither song nor pamphlet cared much for the nights I did not sleep, counting coin and soldiers and wondering which border would break first. Fear sells better than doubt. He leans back, the chair creaking. They say I loved cruelty for its own sake. Yet tell me, was the Sultan gentle when he nailed men to doors and marched boys away in chains? Were the kings of Hungary tender when they burned villages that would not pay? The West writes its own sins in smaller letters, a faint, wry smile. And still, when children wish to whisper of horror, it is my name they borrow. Now, dim the lights a little further in your mind. Tonight we travel not to battlefields, but to quieter surfaces. We had few mirrors, he says. Silver was for coin and blades. Sometimes I saw myself in polished metal or in still water at dawn. His fingers mime the shape of a basin. No fangs, no red eyes, only a tired man with a beard too quickly gone to gray. Yet in their stories, I am a demon who never sleeps, never doubts, never bleeds. For a moment the mask slips, and you glimpse something like weariness. The strangest thing, he confesses, is that after enough winters, you begin to believe them. Part of me remembers the boy hostage at the Ottoman court, learning their tongue, measuring their power, dreaming of a throne and of justice. Another part, his hand opens and closes in the candlelight. Another part hears the tales of forests of the impaled, and thinks, yes, that must be who I am. The monster they needed. The fire settles with a sigh, and the inn feels very small, as if the walls are listening. Safe enough at least to listen, you sit a little straighter while his words curl through the room like smoke. Your world is kinder, perhaps, he says, but tell me, do you not do the same? A father becomes only a villain, or only a saint in the family story. A nation is only victim or only hero in its own books. You smooth away the contradictions, the nights of doubt, the small mercies. His eyes find yours. You make pamphlets of people. You sing ballads of yourselves. Outside, the wind rises, rattling the shutters like distant applause. Inside, his question lingers. When you look into your own still water, into memory, into history, do you see the full face, or only the mask you have learned to wear? The candle guttered once before. Now its flame steadies, as if bracing for whatever part of his story must come next. He lets the silence stretch until it feels almost like another presence in the room. Then, very softly, he says, "Of course, you know the book. You do not have to ask which book. In these lands, there is only one that has truly escaped its covers. Imagine yourself," he murmurs, "as a man who has died more than once and yet never quite manages to stay in his grave." Names matter. One winter, in a town that did not yet exist when I wore a crown, a young scholar sat by a lamp and read aloud from a novel, an English novel, about a count in the Carpathians who bears my father's name and my own. His smile is thin, almost wry. I listened from the shadow by the window, safe enough at least to listen. I heard my stolen name drip from his tongue like candle wax. Dracula, prince, sorcerer, blood drinker, landlord of wolves. He tilts his head, as if still weighing the sentences. Some things he caught. The castle on a cliff, the long road through the Borgo Pass, the wolves howling as if they were the very voice of the forest. The sense that beyond each village lantern, the night has its own laws. That part was true long before I was born, and it will be true long after both of us have faded from story and history. Outside, the wind claws at the shutters. Inside, his words turn the pages for you. But other things. He chuckles, and there is a dryness in it like old paper. No Wallachian prince would leave his fortress half ruined and full of dust. I spent my life forcing order on a land between Hungary and the Ottoman, and this Irishman thinks I would let the tablecloths mildew. His eyes narrow, amused. And the peasants, always muttering, always crossing themselves, always simple. As if these lands were only superstition, and the foreigner's gaze the only clear one. He leans closer, yet I almost love that creature he made. That count is at least consistent. A clear monster. He does not worry about boyars who betray him at supper and bow at dawn. He is not, as I was, a prince some call savior and others devil, depending on which side of the stake they stood. Now dim the lights in your mind and follow him further from the printed page. And then, he says, came the centuries after. The flickering films, the plays, the actors with slicked hair and careful capes. I have watched myself become taller, paler, more elegant than I ever was. I have seen my name turned into fog on a cinema screen. You picture it. Children in plastic capes, plastic teeth clicking, crimson paint at the corners of their mouths. He has seen them too. On one night each year, he muses. Little warriors and witches and dragons march through the streets of cities I never knew existed. Among them walks Dracula, carrying a bucket shaped like a pumpkin. They knock on doors, and instead of fear, they receive sweets. His voice softens. They do not know of the forests of the impaled. They do not know of the Ottoman banners or the snow melted red outside Targovisht. For them, I am only a game. He sits back, and the candle between you gutters, then steadies. Tell me, he whispers, is it better to be remembered as a cartoon monster than not remembered at all? The flame leans toward him, then away, as if it would answer if it could. You open your mouth, but no words come. Outside, something moves in the snow. Too slow for the wind, too patient for a branch, and the next part of his story presses against the door, waiting to be let in. The silence stretches, thin as ice over deep water, and then he rescues you from it with a small, almost amused breath. Do not worry, the guest says, and the candle's flame steadies as if reassured as well. I have not crossed your threshold tonight for blood, not for vengeance. I have had enough of both to last several lifetimes. His eyes, dark as the Carpathian sky beyond the window, turn toward you. I have come for something rarer. Imagine yourself leaning closer, the inn around you hushed, only the snow and the slow ticking of the old clock to mark the passing moments. His voice softens. I have come for a listener. Safe enough, at least, to listen, he adds, with a faint wry twist of his mouth, as though he knows how his name has traveled through centuries of nightmare and ink. Names matter. Once he was simply Vlad, a boy handed over as an Ottoman hostage, learning foreign prayers and foreign punishments in a court where smiling men ordered impalements with the same tone they used to order wine. Once, he was a prince on a burning frontier. Wallachia smoldering between empires, every ally a possible traitor, every winter a new campaign. Later, he became a ruler who chose terror in a terrifying age, raising forests of the impaled where others raised stone walls. Your books, he murmurs, prefer the monster, the fangs, the cloak, the prince of darkness who drinks in your sleep. His gaze drops to his hands, as if expecting to find claws there and finding only knuckles scarred by older battles. But tonight we travel a narrower road. I ask only this, that when you close your eyes, you carry with you a more crowded picture of me, a boy afraid, a son betrayed, a sovereign who believed that fear was the last fortress left to him. He looks toward the door, where the earlier sound in the snow has faded. You have opened something, he says quietly. A door, yes, but not the kind your village tales warn you about. You have opened a door in your mind, a small creaking gate between your world and my story. That is all. Now dim the lights a little further in your imagination. The room grows softer at the edges. The candle halo blurs. When you sleep, he continues, I will not cross into your house or follow you back across your lands. I will step back over the threshold that brought me here. The knock will remain in the Carpathian snow, where it belongs. His smile is almost gentle now. Only the echo of this story may walk with you. Not the prince, not the monster. Just a memory that once a man stood behind the legend you fear. Outside, the wind lifts again, testing the shutters, as if to see whether you will keep that promise when you finally let your eyes close. You listen to the wind probing at the shutters, and slowly you feel the sharpness of the night begin to soften, like a blade cooling after the forge. The stranger's words still linger in the room, but already they are losing their edges, turning from threat into thought, from presence into memory. Names matter. He told you, and in these lands they always have. Dracula, the dragon, the knight of the order sworn to face the Ottoman tide. Dracula, the son of that dragon, or perhaps the son of the devil, depending on who is whispering the story. Chepesh, the impaler, the name that smells of blood and wet earth and forests of upright stakes. Each name a different mask, a different weight. Prince, defender, tyrant, monster. Imagine yourself turning those names over in your mind like old coins, worn by centuries of fingers. On one side, the proud profile of a frontier prince, holding the line while empires press in. On the other, the grim engraving of a tormentor, ruling by fear so absolute that it seemed to seep from the very soil. Between them, the shadowy figure that later ages would dress in a cloak and sharpen into a fanged smile. Fear was his chosen instrument, and he played it without mercy. Lad Tepesh understood that terror could move armies, silence treacherous boyars, and make even the mighty sultan hesitate before crossing a border of impaled men. For the villagers who lived beneath that rule, fear was not a theory. It was the creak of a cart at night, the rumor of soldiers on the road, the knowledge that a wrong word could end on a stake. Yet here you are, safe enough at least to listen, letting that same fear curl around you as a distant chill rather than a mortal danger. Tonight we travel through horrors that have been safely caged in parchment and print, in woodcuts and novels and flickering screens. What was once a tool of power becomes an evening's entertainment. A shadow play you can set aside whenever you choose to close your eyes. Over time, even terror grows tired. History shows that the sharpest horrors, if they are not repeated, begin to blur at the edges. Pamphlet woodcuts fade. Chronicles gather dust. The real stakes rot back into the ground until they are nothing more than dark lines beneath the snow. Memory does not always forgive, but it does often soften. Outside, the night itself is gentling. Dawn begins to pale behind the Carpathians, a thin gray seam opening along the serrated peaks. Snow still falls, slower now, the flakes larger, drifting rather than driven. The wolves that howled so fiercely earlier sink into silence, their tracks already filling, as if the mountains are politely erasing their passage. You picture the inn from outside, a squat shape half buried in white, roof bowed under the weight, chimney breathing a thin ribbon of smoke into the paling sky. The windows glow faintly, small squares of amber against the vast cold blue. Inside, a single candle leans toward its final pool of wax, and somewhere, a chair still holds the warmth of an unseen guest. Now dim the lights in your own thoughts. Let Dracula, and Cheapez drift together until you can no longer quite tell prince from demon, history from legend, or man from the monster he became in other people's mouths. Allow the forests of stakes to sink beneath the snow, the pamphlets to close, the echo of that midnight knock to fade down a long, empty corridor. If you let the images blur just a little more, they become something softer, not a threat at your door, but a distant dreamscape of mountains and towers, of riders and ravens, of names half remembered. And in that gentle distance, fear loosens its grip, becoming only a quiet reminder that every shadow you have walked through tonight belongs to a story you can now set down. So let those shapes blur a little more, until the corridor itself thins to a line, and that line becomes nothing but the crack of a door in a quiet inn, somewhere deep in the Carpathian snow. Imagine yourself standing just inside that doorway as it eases shut, wood against wood, a soft, decisive kiss of grain and iron. The guest's dark coat vanishes into the white outside, boots sinking soundlessly into fresh snow, and with one last muted gust, the cold follows him out. The latch settles into place with a small, well-practiced click, and the air, which had been holding its breath, seems to exhale. The candle flames steady. The draft under the threshold stills. In the far distance, even the wolves sound farther away, as if the very act of closing the door has pushed the night back a few careful steps. The night of the knock is over. The old rule has been kept. Whatever stood on that threshold, half in story and half in history, has done what such visitors must do. It has walked in, spoken its piece, and then walked out again, leaving only words behind. Tonight we travel no further than that. Vlad the Prince, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula the Legend, all those names that remind us that names matter, withdraw politely to their own century. The inn returns to itself. Just creaking beams, a sleepy innkeeper, a log collapsing into embers. Safe enough at least to listen, and now safe enough to forget. Now, dim the lights in your own room if they are not dim already. Feel where you actually are. The weight of your own blankets, the familiar shape of your pillow, the quiet hum or silence that belongs uniquely to the place where you sleep. Your walls are not of blackened timber, but of paint and plaster, or whatever surrounds you. Your door is closed in its own ordinary way. No snow pressing at the windows. No Ottoman armies massing beyond the passes. Only the soft, domestic darkness that knows you. You can let the inn drift back into the mountains. Let the knock become only a sound in a tale. If this wandering through shadow and snow has kept you company tonight, you might, when morning comes and your eyes are fully awake again, choose to subscribe, or tap a like, or leave a comment telling which lands you listened from and whether you managed to stay awake to the very end. For now, though, you do not need to hold any of it. Vlad, Dracula, the inn, the guest at the door, they will wait patiently in that frozen valley, in a pool of candlelight behind a closed door, ready to step across the threshold on some future night. You, instead, can turn toward sleep and let the story sink beneath the surface. And yet, as you drift, there is one last door we have not quite closed. So if your eyes are still open or your thoughts keep circling back to that inn door, this last stretch is just for you. Not for learning, not for following every thread of history, but simply for drifting a little farther from waking. Imagine yourself hovering between places now, your mind wandering in slow loops. Part of you is still in that valley, watching the snow sift down around the eaves. Part of you is here in your own room, in your own century, safe enough at least to listen as the story softens and thins like breath on a cold window. Tonight we travel only in memory. A child once lay under a carved sign of a dragon, the wood darkened by smoke and time, while his father's new title, Dracula, settled over the household like an invisible cloak. Names matter, and that child would grow into a prince whose very name, Dracula, would echo across centuries, reshaped by rumor and fear. You remember him as a hostage, too, a thin boy at an Ottoman court, learning the measured steps of diplomacy and the sharper language of terror. You saw him return to his battered lands, where power was a flickering candle and betrayal waited in every shadow. In your mind's eye, forests of stakes once rose like a grim, leafless orchard, and a ruler called Tepesh tried to hold his throne with iron and splinters. Then there was another prisoner, not of palaces but of stone, a man walled in and forgotten, counting the passing of seasons by the change in light through a slit of sky. And much later still, a different kind of captive, a traveler perhaps not unlike you, seated in that lonely inn when a guest knocked after midnight, asking, so politely, to be invited across the threshold. Yet all of it is far away. Other centuries, other continents, other lives. The real Wallachian prince, the Ottoman marches, the Saxon pamphlets, the ink of Bram Stoker's notes, the flicker of silent film and the glow of cinema screens. Layer upon layer, until the old stories are wrapped in paper, celluloid, and whispered tales, safely pressed between the pages of history. Now dim the lights inside your own thoughts. Let your breath lengthen a little. Inhale slowly, as if drawing in only the quiet of falling snow outside the inn, each flake softening the world. Exhale, and imagine releasing the tension of battles and forests of the impaled, of dungeons and locked doors, of knuckles rapping on wood when the clock has already slipped past 12. Again a slow breath in, cool and clear, and out, letting go of princes and prisoners, of dragons and devils, of every sharp edge in the story, until only the hush remains. Somewhere in that valley, a single candle still burns on the inn's counter, its flame small but steady. Watch it for a moment, the way it bends when the door stirs, the way wax pools like pale gold around the wick. Then the innkeeper's fingers close gently over the light. A soft puff of air, a tiny sound, and the flame is gone. Smoke curls upward in a thin gray ribbon, fading into the rafters, leaving only the faint glow of embers, the deep, patient dark, and the quiet space just before sleep arrives. For a moment, let the darkness settle around you like a cloak, not threatening, simply present. You know the inn is still there in the quiet of your imagination, the embers low, the guest beyond the door waiting. Now, dim the lights a little more in your mind, and step with me from the creaking floorboards of the story into the steadier ground of history. Vlad III was a real man. He was born in 1431 in Transylvanian lands under Hungarian rule. He ruled Wallachia, not Transylvania itself, 3 separate times, briefly in 1448, then from 1456 to 1462, and once more around 1476. His world stood between great powers. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary. To the south and east, the Ottoman Empire pressing hard across the Balkans. Wallachia was a narrow, dangerous bridge between them. His father Vlad Dracula belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric brotherhood sworn to fight the Ottomans. Names matter. From that order came the family's fearsome label, Dracula, from dragon, or, in local ears, devil. Dracula meant simply son of the dragon, or son of the devil. Vlad grew up as a political hostage at the Ottoman court, learned their language and tactics, and later used terror, especially impalement, as a deliberate weapon of war and rule. Some horrors are well attested. Contemporary chronicles and letters describe mass impalements, forced labor, and harsh punishment of boyars and peasants alike. The Forest of the Impaled outside Targoviste in 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II advanced, appears in multiple sources. Yet many of the most lurid tales, boiling people alive, elaborate dining rituals among the corpses, impossible numbers of victims, come mainly from hostile Saxon pamphlets and later sensational retellings, printed and reprinted for readers who loved a good shudder. Imagine yourself turning one of those thin, cheap pages by candlelight. Woodcut images of a grim prince, bodies on stakes, villages in flames. It is propaganda as much as report, shaped by merchants and nobles who hated Vlad's taxes and his assaults on their power. Safe enough at least to listen, they could enjoy his cruelty from a distance. Centuries later, Bram Stoker opened his own books. In his notes for the novel Dracula, he borrowed the name, a few historical hints, and the Transylvanian setting. But his count is not a careful portrait of the Wallachian prince. In the novel, Dracula is an ancient vampire who travels from his castle in the Carpathians to England, preys upon Lucy and Mina, battles Professor Van Helsing and his companions, and is finally destroyed at the edge of his homeland. Beyond the name Dracula, the vague mention of battles with the Ottomans, and a taste for impalement as color, very little of Vlad's real biography survives. Tonight we travel further away with each retelling. Early films like Nosferatu changed the name and twisted the story into something dreamlike and plague-haunted. Later movies gave Dracula sweeping capes, aristocratic charm, hypnotic stares, and new powers, turning to mist, commanding wolves, gliding through modern cities. The historical prince, muddy-booted and exhausted from campaigning, fades into a shadow behind these elegant monsters. So, as you lie there, perhaps half awake, remember this. You are listening to echoes. Political pamphlets, village whispers, Gothic novels, and flickering films, all layered over one another. They are shadows on a wall, not hands on your door. Stories cannot cross your threshold without your consent. You choose which to invite in and which to leave outside, knocking softly in the snow. And yet, outside your room, the world goes on turning. Tonight we travel back, just for a moment, to the town where this story first drew breath. Imagine yourself once more in Sihishara, that small fortified jewel in Transylvania where, they say, a certain prince first opened his eyes to these lands of mist and tower and bell. By day, the cobbled streets are busy, almost cheerful. Tourists drift beneath pastel facades, pause under the clock tower, and tilt their heads to read the plaques that whisper, "Here, in 1431, was born Vlad, called Dracula." Names matter. You can almost hear the guide's voice as he stands before the yellow house, explaining how Dracula meant son of the dragon, how that dragon became a devil in the mouths of enemies, how Ottoman campaigns and frontier terror turned a living ruler into a figure of shadow and power. Cameras click, souvenir bags rustle, someone buys a refrigerator magnet with fangs and a little cape. History shrinks into a logo, but then night comes. Shops close, one metal shutter after another grating down. The last bus sighs away. The day's footsteps drain from the square until only your own echo between the walls. The steep streets grow empty, and the town folds itself inward. A few windows glow with sleepy yellow. A television mutters behind lace curtains. Somewhere, a dog barks once and thinks better of it. Now dim the lights in your mind and walk with me up one narrow lane. A small doorway stands half open, candlelight breathing softly behind its glass. Inside, a local guide has finished his final talk of the evening. The pamphlets about Vlad are stacked in a neat, weary pile. A map of Wallachia curls at the corners. He closes a well-thumbed book of the prince's history, rests his hand for a moment on the dragon printed on the cover, and then, with a quiet patience learned over years of retelling the same story, he leans forward and blows out the candle. In the sudden dark, the town feels older. Under your feet, the cobblestones are smooth, but beneath them lie older stones, and under those the soil itself that once shuddered with the iron ring of hoofbeats. Messengers riding hard between fortress and frontier, soldiers sent to guard the passes against the Ottoman advance. Perhaps even Vlad's own retinue, cloaks snapping in the winter wind as they climb toward the citadel. The centuries are stacked here like layers of wax on a candle, each melted and cooled one over the other. Above a souvenir shop selling plastic fangs and crimson postcards, a child turns over and sleep. In the room where keychains rattle on their hooks by day, there are bunk beds and scattered toys by night. A poster of a football star, not a warlord, hangs on the wall. The child does not know, not really, what it means that a real prince once bore the name now printed on the mugs downstairs, or that his missing grave helped feed tales of the restless dead. Imagine yourself as one of those sleepers, wrapped in blankets above centuries of story, safe enough at least to listen, even in dreams, while the town keeps its quiet watch. Outside, the dragon's name lies folded into stone and soil and fading ink. Inside, your breathing finds a slow, even rhythm. Whatever knocks once did echo through these streets, whatever riders once clattered past this hill, they are long gone now. You rest in the gentle space between what was and what is told. And there, on that ridge of time, it is easy to let your eyes close at last. And as your eyes grow heavy on that quiet ridge between ages, another sound drifts in from the edge of awareness. Not hoofbeats this time, not the clash of princes and Ottoman steel, but something smaller, closer. A soft, uncertain tap, as if the night itself had found a door and was politely asking to be remembered. Imagine yourself back in your own room now, the stone towers and impaled forests of our story receding like distant hills. The walls around you are familiar, yet as the world darkens, every creak seems to lean forward, every whisper of wind seems to listen. A pipe shivers somewhere behind the plaster. The radiator sighs, a neighbor closes a cupboard 3 rooms away, and your drowsy mind, primed by centuries of knocks and guests after midnight, quietly wonders, was that someone? It is one of the oldest tricks of the shadow. A branch brushes glass and becomes a hand. The house settles and becomes a footstep on the stair. The heating clicks and becomes a knuckle against wood. Tonight we travel not through bloody chronicles, but through these gentle mischiefs of sound, the way an old building likes to remind you that it too is alive in the dark. Now dim the lights around that thought and look at it more kindly. Perhaps that faint tapping is only the beams of your home stretching after a long day, the way a weary soldier once stretched beside the campfire. Perhaps the wind is merely checking the latches, like an overcautious innkeeper in a snowbound Transylvanian village. Perhaps it is your own mind, carrying a small bundle of worries, knocking to see if you will take them in. Here, we change the rule. In the tales of this land, a vampire cannot cross a threshold without invitation. Power waits on a single word, a single gesture. Names matter, and so do welcomes. In the same way, your worries, your restless thoughts, your rehearsed conversations from the day, all stand politely outside the door of your attention. They may knock, once, twice, even 3 times, but they cannot enter unless you rise, unlatch, and usher them in. Tonight, you do not have to open anything. Not the door in the hall, not the door in your chest. Every sound that pretends to be a summons can pass unanswered, left to wander the corridors until morning thins it to something harmless and small. You are allowed to hear a knock and simply roll deeper into your pillow. Safe enough at least to listen, you can let the whole procession of thoughts remain on the other side. If a decision needs you, it will still be there in the daylight. If a problem is real, it will not dissolve just because you rested first. Dawn has a way of shortening shadows, of turning looming figures into coats on chairs, of revealing that the guest at the door was only the wind, and that the only invitation that mattered was the one you offered to sleep. And so, as those imagined coats on chairs resolve themselves back into harmless shapes, as the guest at the door becomes only a memory of wind and wood, there is a quieter presence that remains. It is you, here, in the soft half-light of your own room, and this slow, winding story that has kept you company through the long Carpathian night. Imagine yourself lying, just as you are now, covers gathered, the air still, the world outside reduced to a distant hush. Somewhere beyond your walls other rooms exist, other beds, other listeners stretched out beneath different roofs in different lands, and yet for a while tonight you all shared the same snow, the same inn, the same patient knocking on the same old door. Separate, and somehow side by side. There is a kind of quiet gratitude in that, a thank you that does not need to be spoken aloud. You chose, among all the noises of this restless age, to let this one voice and this one story move through your room. Tonight we travel together through snow-muted villages and along the shadowed roads where a Wallachian prince once rode. And even if your eyes closed halfway through, you still walked far enough. If your thoughts drifted, if you slipped away as the innkeeper banked the fire and the wolves grew faint, that is all right. Stories like this have always done double work. On the surface, they trace history and legend, the slow transformation of a name like Dracula from prince to monster, from dragon to devil. Beneath, they simply keep watch while you drift, like a candle left burning in a window until morning. Now, dim the lights a little more, if any still glow behind your eyes. Let the last embers of the Carpathian hearth settle. Perhaps, somewhere else, another listener is turning on their side at this very moment, hearing the same sentence, feeling the same gentle pull toward sleep. A small, invisible circle drawn across centuries and borders, held together by nothing more than a shared breath and a shared story. If you wish, you may return to this inn on other nights, or follow different roads entirely. There are other legends waiting, other crossroads where the living and the dead pause to consider each other, other ottomans at the border, and other names that matter. The pace will be the same, slow, careful, unhurried enough that you are always safe enough at least to listen, never demanded to stay awake. And if you do not remember how we left the castle or when the snow began to fall more softly, that is fine. The story remembers you. It has walked beside your breathing, measured its steps to your heartbeat, and now it is ready to step back. So let this voice fade gently, like footsteps receding down the corridor of some old inn, each board creaking a little softer, a little farther away. What remains is only the sound of your own breathing, steady and sufficient, and the certainty that the door is closed, The night is kind, and sleep has already accepted your invitation. What remains is only the sound of your own breathing, steady and sufficient, and the certainty that the door is closed. The night is kind, and sleep has already accepted your invitation. Imagine yourself, just for a moment more, in a different room of this inn. Not the creaking corridor, not the snow-dimmed window, but a quiet library tucked beneath the eaves. Shelves lean under the weight of centuries, and on a low table rests a heavy leather-bound volume, its clasps cool and stubborn beneath your fingers. This is the book of Vlad's history and of the guest who knocked after midnight, a book of princes and Ottomans, crossroads and thresholds, of names that refused to stay buried. You feel its weight as you close it. The pages sigh together like a long breath finally released, and the echo of all we have traced tonight settles into the binding. Forests of the impaled, village whispers, Saxon pamphlets turning a frontier warlord into a legend of shadow and power, Bram Stoker bending that legend into Dracula. Each scene folds neatly away, pressed flat between the covers. The story is not gone, only resting. Now you lift the book, slow and careful, and slide it back onto the shelf. Wood against leather, leather against leather, a faint, contented thud. The spine disappears among other tales of distant lands and older nights, safe enough at least to listen to again when you choose. The library grows a little quieter, as if even the dust motes are relieved to be left in peace. Out here, beyond the inn, the world is less carved oak and candlelight, more glass and pixels. Yet the ritual can be the same. As you close that imaginary book, you can let your real night close too. You might dim the screen one notch, then another, until the glow softens and your room remembers it is dark. You might turn the phone face down, like a book placed gently on a bedside table, or you might simply let autoplay rest for once, so no new story, no new voice crosses your threshold before morning. You do not have to do anything else, not now, not in this hour. If you decide, on some other night, that you would like more journeys like this, more history braided with legend, more quiet walks through Carpathian snow, you can always subscribe or save this video like a ribbon slipped between pages for future sleepless hours. Names matter, but bookmarks do too. Comments, likes, all the small rituals of the waking world can wait for tomorrow. Let them. If a thought lingers, it will still be there with the daylight. Tonight your only task is to rest, to let the prince and the inn and the guest drift to the far edge of your mind, like lights seen across a valley. And know this, the Carpathians are not going anywhere. The inn still stands where the road bends. The guest who knocked after midnight remains at the edge of the firelight, patient and unhurried. This chapter is closed, but it is carefully, lovingly shelved. Whenever you wish, you can return, reopen the heavy leather cover, and step once more into the story, quietly, on your own time, and only when you invite it in. Imagine yourself standing once more in that familiar doorway, not at midnight now, but at the thin, colorless edge of dawn. The storm has passed. The night's voices have fallen silent. What remains is only the room itself. The inn returned to its own quiet history, as if all that unfolded here were nothing more than a passing dream. Chairs stand slightly askew, pushed back by hands that are no longer here, their legs leaving faint tracks in the rushes on the floor. Tankards rest where they were abandoned, rims dulled by a film of cooled foam, a stripe of wine dried to a dark, almost brown shadow along the lip. The great hearth, which only hours ago roared and leapt like some captive beast, has sunk into a low gray bed, ash mounded in soft drifts around a few stubborn coals that still glow like watchful eyes beneath the surface. Now dim the lights in your own room and let your gaze travel slowly over this one. A spoon left half submerged in a bowl, the last curl of steam finally gone. A cloak forgotten on the back of a chair, its hem stiff with melted and refrozen snow. The air holds the faint scent of smoke and spiced broth, and beneath it, that colder smell of stone and winter, of lands that have known centuries of waiting. The guest is gone. His chair stands empty, angled slightly toward the fire as if he might return at any moment, one hand on the carved arm, the other cradling a cup he never quite finished. At the threshold, the floorboards are bare. No wet prints, no melted patches, no trace of a boot that crossed from storm to warmth. The door's iron latch is dry and unmarked. It is as though he never lifted his hand to knock, never stepped across the line that every old village in these lands still calls the safest border of all. The innkeeper moves through this quiet like someone crossing a chapel before the first bell. He says nothing. He does not call for help or hum an old song. He simply opens one shutter, then another, letting in a pale, pewter light that flattens the candle flames and turns the tankards to dull, pewter ghosts of themselves. He shakes out tablecloths with practiced, unthinking gestures, sending up brief, swirling ghosts of dust that vanish almost before you can see them. Names matter, but he does not speak the one that hovered here last night. Perhaps he never heard it at all, and that is its own kind of protection. Outside, the world has been remade. The snow has stopped, the sky a washed-out veil above the dark fringe of the forest. A single set of hoofprints leads away from the stable yard, deep at first, each impression sharply cut in the crust, then softer, then gone. Where the first weak rays of sun touch the ground, the snow's surface dulls and slumps, and the trail simply dissolves into a formless sheen of meltwater. If you came upon it now, with no story to guide you, would you ever guess what passed here in the dark? Tonight we travel elsewhere, but for this moment you are invited to linger. Take one last look at the inn. The chairs, the cooling ashes, the open shutters admitting a thin, indifferent light. Let the scene fade, slowly, like breath on a cold window pane, the cloudy imprint shrinking, thinning, until the glass stands clear and empty once more. The room remains, the road still bends, the Carpathians still watch. But this chapter closes so gently you almost do not hear it. And just when everything seems finished, when every trace has been wiped away, something small and unexpected waits at the edge of the next page, ready to knock again, only once you have chosen to listen. And just when everything seems finished, when every trace has been wiped away, something small and unexpected waits at the edge of the next page, ready to knock again, only once you have chosen to listen. Now, dim the lights, not in the Carpathian Inn, but here, in the quiet country of your own room. The road folds itself away, the snowbound villages close their shutters, and the old Prince of Wallachia retreats back into history as neatly as a book returning to its shelf. Around you, there are no crossroads, no howling wolves, only the ordinary, tender furniture of your life, resting in the dark. Imagine yourself lying where you are, exactly as you are, and notice what is not happening. No door creaks, no latch lifts, no guest stands waiting on the threshold, hat in hand, asking to be invited across. The only footsteps are the slow, steady ones of your own breathing, going back and forth along the corridor of your chest, patient and unhurried. The stories have gone still. Every impaled forest, every Ottoman campaign, every whispered rumor about a prince called Dracula has been folded, quietly, into silence. Names matter, but for tonight, even the most powerful of them have been set aside, like armor unbuckled and laid down after a long ride. All doors are closed. All roads are resting. All guests, courteous and otherwise, have departed into the distance. Safe enough at least to listen, you can feel how the room itself keeps watch, walls standing guard, curtains hanging like soft sentries, the faintest hum of night sounds, pipes, distant traffic, a breeze against the window moves through the dark like a gentle patrol, checking each corner and finding nothing that wishes you harm. Nothing knocks now but sleep. Tonight, we travel nowhere at all. The inn is shuttered. The castle gate is barred. The last candle in the last tower has burned down to a harmless thread of smoke. Only one visitor lingers nearby, and it is the kindest of them all. Sleep does not hammer or demand. It never forces the lock. It simply waits on the far side of your thoughts, patient as snow, until you are ready to open. Let those thoughts slow. Let the bright, busy words of the day loosen and drift apart, like ink dropped into clear water, curling and spreading, thinning and softening until there is no edge between story and silence, between memory and dream.